This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I've debated for weeks whether to post this. I know there are plenty of you out there who'll think I'm making this up or that we were just high out of our minds. But I need to get this off my chest and maybe warn some of you who think it's cool to go looking for trouble in places you shouldn't. This happened last October when me, Cliff, Mike, and Danny decided to do a weekend camping trip in Kaibab National Forest. We're all in our late 20s, grew up together in Flagstaff, and try to get together a few times a year for these kinds of trips since we've scattered for work. I've been camping my whole life. I know the difference between being spooked by normal forest sounds and whatever the hell this was. We picked a spot pretty deep in the western part of the forest, maybe 10 miles from the edge of the Navajo Nation lands. It's beautiful country out there. Tall pines, juniper, these massive rock formations. During the day, it's peaceful. At night, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. We arrived around 2 p.m. on Saturday, set up our 2 tents, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon hiking and bullshitting like we always do. Nothing unusual. The weather was perfect. That crisp fall air that's not too cold yet. As the sun started setting, we got a good fire going and broke out the cooler. Few beers, some whiskey Danny brought, and Mike packed his weed pen. Nothing crazy. We weren't planning to get wasted, just relaxed. That's when the conversation took a turn I wish it hadn't. Danny, who's been dating a Navajo woman for about 6 months, started talking about some of the things her family had told him. Specifically, he brought up skinwalkers. I remember actually saying something like, "Dude, maybe we shouldn't talk about this stuff out here." I wasn't trying to be superstitious, but I've lived in Arizona long enough to respect certain boundaries. But Danny kept going, talking about how his girlfriend's family never directly discusses these things, how they've warned him not to either. Mike, a bit buzzed by this point, chimed in about how he'd been seeing all these TikToks about skinwalkers lately and thought it was just folklore to scare kids. "No, man," Danny said, getting serious. "Her grandfather took me aside last month and told me never to mention them, especially at night. Said saying their name or talking about them can draw their attention." "Then why the fuck are you bringing it up now?" Cliff laughed, but I could tell he was a little uneasy too. Danny shrugged. "Just thought it was interesting. All these kids online making videos about them like it's a joke, and her family won't even say the word." We kept drinking. The conversation eventually drifted to other topics, but there was this weird tension that hadn't been there before. Around 11 p.m., Cliff stood up and said he needed to take a leak. "Don't go too far," Mike joked. "The skinwalkers might get you." "Shut up, man," Cliff said, grabbing his phone for a flashlight. "I'll be right back." He walked off into the trees, the beam of his phone light bouncing between the trunks until it disappeared. We kept talking, but after about 15 minutes, I realized Cliff hadn't come back. "Yo, where's Cliff?" I asked, interrupting whatever Danny was saying about work. Mike looked around. "Probably got lost, you know how he is." "I'm gonna go check," I said, standing up. I wasn't super worried yet, but something felt off. I grabbed my proper flashlight from the tent, one of those heavy mag lights that can double as a weapon if needed. "Want me to come?" Danny offered. "Nah, I'm good. Keep the fire going." I headed in the direction Cliff had gone, sweeping my flashlight across the ground to follow his footprints in the dirt and pine needles. The forest was dead quiet. That's what hit me first. No crickets, no rustling of nocturnal animals, no wind in the trees. Just absolute silence except for the crunch of my own footsteps. I called out, "Cliff, You okay, man? My voice sounded wrong, too loud and somehow muffled at the same time, like the trees were absorbing the sound. That's when I heard it. Cliff's voice, but faint. Over here. I turned toward the sound, relieved. Dude, what are you doing? We were getting worried. Over here, he called again, his voice sounding flat, almost monotone. I followed the voice for maybe 100 yards, coming to a small clearing bathed in moonlight. And there was Cliff, standing with his back to me, looking up at the sky. Hey, I said, approaching him. What are you doing, stargazing? We thought you fell in a hole or something. He didn't respond or turn around, just kept staring upward, completely still. Something was wrong. The hair on my arms stood up and my stomach twisted into a knot. I slowed my approach, stopping about 15 feet away. Cliff? That's when I felt a hand on my shoulder from behind. I nearly jumped out of my skin, spinning around with the flashlight raised like a club. It was Cliff. The real Cliff. Jesus Christ, I gasped. You scared the shit out of me. But Cliff wasn't looking at me. He was staring past me, his face drained of color, eyes wide with terror. Who the fuck is that? He whispered. A cold wave of dread washed over me as I slowly turned back toward the clearing. The figure I had thought was Cliff was still standing there, still facing away. I raised my flashlight, the beam landing on the back of the figure's head. It had dark hair like Cliff's, wore a similar flannel shirt. But as the light hit it, the figure began to turn. Slowly, unnaturally, like its joints weren't working right. When it finally faced us, I felt my blood freeze. It looked almost like Cliff, but wrong in ways I can't fully describe. Its eyes reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's, but there was no life in them, just empty, glassy orbs. Its mouth hung open too wide, stretched in a way a human mouth can't stretch. The skin looked waxy, almost like plastic, but with too many details to be fake. For one horrible second, we all just stood there. Me, the real Cliff behind me, and this thing that was pretending to be him. Then it moved, not walking, but lurching forward in a jerky, broken motion, like it was trying to imitate human movement but couldn't quite get it right. Its limbs bent at odd angles. It made a sound, not words, but a raspy, wet clicking noise from deep in its throat. Run! Cliff screamed, grabbing my arm and yanking me backward. We bolted. I've never run so fast in my life. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, but pure adrenaline kept me upright. I could hear it behind us, not footsteps, but a strange scuttling noise, too fast for comfort. The sound of something that shouldn't be able to move that quickly. Somehow we found our way back to camp. Mike and Danny were still by the fire, looking confused as we burst into the clearing, gasping and terrified. Pack up, now! We need to go! I shouted, already grabbing things and shoving them into my backpack. What the hell happened? Mike stood up, alarmed. There's something out there, Cliff said, his voice shaking. It looked like me, but it wasn't me. It's following us. Danny immediately started breaking down his tent without question. Mike looked skeptical for about 2 seconds before the expression on our faces convinced him. What do you mean it looked like you? He asked, starting to help pack up. We don't have time, I snapped. Just grab what you can and let's go. We abandoned half our gear, tents half collapsed, cooking stuff, chairs, all left behind. We grabbed our backpacks, doused the fire with our drinking water, and headed for the cars as fast as we could. The entire time I kept looking back, expecting to see that thing emerge from the trees. The forest remained completely silent around us, which somehow made it worse. Where were the normal night sounds? Even after hiking for 15 minutes back toward the parking area, there wasn't a single cricket chirp or rustle of leaves. We were about halfway to the cars when Danny stopped suddenly, causing me to crash into his back. "Listen," he whispered. We all froze. At first I heard nothing. Then from somewhere to our right came that voice again. "Over here." It still sounded like Cliff, but flat, emotionless. We exchanged terrified glances and changed direction, veering left instead of continuing straight. "Over here!" The voice came again, now from directly ahead of us. "It's hurting us," Danny muttered. "Fuck this," Mike said, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling 911. No signal. Not surprising that deep in the forest, but still devastating in the moment. "We need to stick together and keep moving," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "The parking lot can't be more than half a mile away." We formed a tight group, walking as quietly as possible, everyone scanning the trees with our flashlights. The forest seemed to close in around us, the spaces between trees narrower than I remembered, the darkness deeper. That's when I noticed something odd about our shadows cast by our flashlights. Mine looked normal, so did Mike's and Danny's. But Cliff's shadow, it didn't match his movements exactly. There was a slight delay, like it was moving a fraction of a second after he did. I didn't point it out. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. I just picked up the pace, praying the parking lot would appear soon. After what felt like an eternity, we saw the reflective glint of our cars through the trees. Nobody spoke as we broke into a run, fumbling for keys, throwing our backpacks into the trunks. "My car won't start," Danny suddenly called out, panic rising in his voice. He turned the key, but the engine just clicked. "Get in with us," Mike shouted from his SUV, already started and running. Danny abandoned his car, sprinting over and jumping into Mike's back seat. Cliff and I were already inside. As Mike reversed and spun the car around, I looked out the window one last time at the forest. There, at the edge of the tree line, stood 4 figures. 4 shadows that looked exactly like us, standing perfectly still, watching the car pull away. Even from that distance, I could see the moonlight reflecting in their eyes. Nobody spoke for the first 20 minutes of the drive. We were all processing what had happened, trying to make sense of it. Finally, Danny broke the silence. "I shouldn't have talked about them. My girlfriend's grandfather warned me." "You think that's what it was?" Mike asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "A skinwalker?" "What else could it be?" Cliff said, his voice still shaky. "It looked like me. It was trying to be me." We drove straight back to Flagstaff, all piling into my apartment since it was closest. None of us wanted to be alone. We spent the rest of the night researching skinwalkers, reading stories from people who claimed to have encountered them, and comparing notes to what we'd experienced. Everything matched up: the mimicry, the unnatural movements, the silence in the forest, the way it had tried to isolate us. Danny called his girlfriend around dawn, telling her what happened. She went quiet for a long time, then told him she was coming over. When she arrived, she brought her grandfather with her. The old man didn't want many details. He just asked where exactly we had been, nodded grimly, and then performed what I think was a blessing or protection ceremony of some kind. He burned sage, said prayers in Navajo, and put marks with some kind of powder on our foreheads. Before he left, he pulled me aside. "You saw it with your own eyes," he said. "Now you know why we don't speak of them. They hear their name. They come when called. And once they find you—" He shook his head. "Be careful what you invite." That was 6 months ago. Danny's car was eventually recovered by forest rangers, though the battery was mysteriously drained. Our abandoned camping gear was never found. I haven't been camping since. Neither has Cliff. I've had recurring nightmares where I'm back in that clearing, but this time, when I turn around, everyone is a skinwalker except me. I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced there's something watching me from the corner of my room. I'm not posting this for attention or because I think it makes a good story. I'm posting this as a warning. All those TikTok trends, all those YouTube videos exploring skinwalker legends, they're playing with fire. The Navajo people have kept quiet about these entities for generations for a reason. Some things aren't meant to be discussed casually, especially in places where they might be listening. Be respectful of traditions and warnings that have been around longer than your social media accounts. And if you're camping and the forest goes completely silent, pack up and leave immediately. Don't wait. Don't investigate. Just go. And if you hear a familiar voice calling over here from the darkness, run the other way. I still can't sleep with my windows open. It's been 8 months since it happened, and I've tried talking to therapists about it. But they all give me that look, like I'm making it up or had some kind of shared hallucination. But I know what I saw. We all saw it. And sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I can hear something scratching at my bedroom window, even though I live on the 17th floor of an apartment building in the middle of Chicago now. It was supposed to be just another one of our annual summer trips. Me, Eric, Jimmy, and Peter have been doing this since college, renting some place for a long weekend to fish, drink beer, and just get away from our lives for a bit. Usually we went to cabins or campgrounds, places where we could be outdoors but still have a toilet. This year was my turn to organize, and I found this lake house online, about an hour north of where we all live. The listing had these gorgeous photos. A 2-story house right on this massive lake with a dock surrounded by woods. It had 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a huge kitchen, and a deck overlooking the water. The weird part was how cheap it was, like suspiciously cheap for a place that size in peak summer season. But I figured maybe the owner just needed to fill a cancellation or something. I should have known better. We all took Friday off work and planned to meet at the house around 2 p.m. I got there first, following the GPS down this narrow dirt road that seemed to go on forever. I remember thinking how isolated it was. We had driven past the last gas station about 20 minutes before turning onto this road, and there were no other houses visible anywhere, just trees and more trees. When I finally pulled up to the house, my first impression was that the photos hadn't lied. It really was beautiful. This old wooden structure painted dark green with white trim, massive windows facing the lake, and a wraparound porch. The lake stretched out behind it, glittering in the afternoon sun, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first as I got out of my car. I stood there for a moment, luggage in hand, and that's when I realized what was bothering me. It was completely silent. No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling in the underbrush, no insects buzzing, nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive silence that made the hair on my arms stand up. I've spent a lot of time in the woods, and they're never silent. Never. I tried to shake off the feeling as I went inside using the code the owner had sent me. The interior was rustic but nice. Hardwood floors, big stone fireplace in the living room, and mounted deer heads and fish on the walls. It was the kind of place where someone's grandpa probably spent decades collecting hunting trophies. The furniture was old but solid, lots of plaid and dark wood. As I was checking out the bedrooms upstairs, I heard tires on the gravel outside. Eric and Jimmy had arrived together, followed a few minutes later by Peter. Everyone was in good spirits, cracking jokes and arguing over who got which bedroom. I didn't mention the weird silence outside. I figured maybe it was just an odd time of day, Or maybe there had been a predator in the area recently that scared off the wildlife. "Dude, this place is a steal," Peter said, throwing his duffel bag onto one of the beds. "How much did you say it was again?" I told him the price, and he whistled. "There's got to be a catch," Jimmy said, looking out the window toward the lake. "Maybe the water's toxic or something." We all laughed it off and spent the next couple hours unpacking, exploring the house, and setting up our stuff. There was no TV or internet, just like the listing had warned, but we had brought board games, cards, and enough beer to last the weekend. The kitchen was huge, with an old gas stove and a massive wooden table that could seat 8 people. Around 5 p.m., Eric decided he was going to grill some steaks he'd brought. The house had a charcoal grill on the back deck facing the lake. While he was doing that, the rest of us grabbed beers and walked down to check out the dock. The lake was beautiful, crystal clear water stretching out for what seemed like miles, with dense forest covering the shores on all sides. But again, that silence was there. No loons calling, no fish jumping, nothing. "Is it just me, or is it really quiet out here?" Jimmy finally said, and I felt relieved that someone else had noticed. "Yeah, I was thinking the same thing when I first got here," I replied. "No birds or anything." Peter cupped his hands around his mouth and let out a loud, "Hello!" His voice echoed across the water, and then nothing. No response from nature at all. Just the echo fading, and then that same heavy silence. "Weird," he said, taking a swig of his beer. "Maybe there's a forest fire nearby or something driving all the animals away." We would have checked our phones, but none of us had service. The listing had mentioned limited cell coverage, but we all had 0 bars. Eric eventually called us back to the house, proudly presenting his completely burnt steaks. We gave him endless shit for it, but ate them anyway, washing the charcoal taste down with more beer. As the sun started to set, the darkness around the house seemed to deepen quickly. The woods became this impenetrable black wall just beyond the yard, and even with the porch lights on, you couldn't see more than a few feet into the trees. We stayed up late playing cards and drinking, telling the same old stories we always did on these trips. It was close to 1 a.m. when we finally decided to call it a night. I took the bedroom at the end of the hall upstairs, which had a window facing the side of the house where the woods came closest. I was pretty buzzed from the beer, but not drunk enough to fall asleep right away. I lay there listening to the old house creak and settle, the absolute silence from outside making every small noise inside seem louder. The moon was bright that night, sending this silvery light through my window and casting strange shadows on the wall. And that's when I saw it for the first time. I was just drifting off when something made me open my eyes. There was a shadow outside my window, what looked like the silhouette of a person standing there, just a dark shape against the night sky. I blinked hard, thinking it must be a trick of the light, but it was still there when I opened my eyes again. The thing is, my room was on the 2nd floor, and that side of the house had no porch roof or tree branches nearby, just a straight drop to the ground about 15 feet below. There couldn't possibly be anyone standing there. I sat up quickly, fully awake now, my heart pounding. As soon as I moved, the shadow disappeared. I got out of bed and cautiously approached the window, telling myself it must have been a branch or something casting a shadow. But when I looked out, there was nothing there that could have made that shape. No trees close enough. Nothing. Just the moonlit yard and the dark edge of the forest beyond. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I was the first one up. I made coffee in the kitchen and took it out to the front porch, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen the night before was just my imagination or a weird dream. In the daylight, the place looked normal again, beautiful even. But that unnatural silence was still there. No morning bird song, no chattering squirrels, nothing. As I sat sipping my coffee, I happened to glance toward the tree line at the edge of the property. Something moved, something big. It wasn't like a deer or a bear moving through the underbrush. This was quick, low to the ground, and it disappeared so fast I couldn't really make out what it was. Just a dark blur that was there and then gone. The others came down one by one and we made breakfast and planned our day. No one else mentioned seeing anything strange, so I kept quiet about both the shadow at my window and whatever I'd glimpsed in the trees. We spent most of the day out on the lake, fishing from the rickety old rowboat we found tied to the dock. Even out on the water, there was no wildlife, no fish jumping, no turtles sunning on logs, nothing. We caught absolutely nothing all day. "This lake is dead," Peter complained after hours without a bite. "What the hell?" We gave up on fishing and headed back to the house in the late afternoon. Eric grilled again, burning the hamburgers this time, and we ate on the deck as the sun started to go down. The beer was flowing, and the weird vibe from the place seemed less important as the evening wore on. We were all laughing and telling stories when Jimmy suddenly stopped mid-sentence and stared at something over my shoulder. "What's that?" he asked, pointing toward the forest edge. We all turned to look, but there was nothing there. "I swear I saw something move," he said, frowning, "like right along the tree line there." "Probably a deer," I said quickly, even though I knew damn well there weren't any deer around this place. I hadn't seen so much as a chipmunk since we arrived. As darkness fell, we moved inside to the living room. The mood had shifted a bit. Everyone seemed jumpier, glancing at windows more often. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. I hesitated at my bedroom door, not wanting to sleep in the same room where I'd seen that shadow, but too embarrassed to ask to switch with someone else. I made sure the window was locked, drew the curtains tight, and got into bed. Despite the beers, sleep didn't come easily. I lay there listening to the house, which seemed to make more noise than it had the night before. Creaks and groans that sounded almost like footsteps on the stairs or in the hallway. I told myself it was just the others going to the bathroom or getting water. I must have eventually dozed off because I was jolted awake by a scream. Not the kind of scream someone makes when they're startled. This was pure terror. It was Jimmy. I jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway, almost colliding with Eric, who had come out of his room too. We raced to Jimmy's room at the opposite end of the hall. Peter was already there, standing frozen in the doorway. Jimmy was sitting on the floor, pressed against the wall opposite his window. He was drenched in sweat, wide-eyed, and pointing at the window. "There's something out there," he whispered hoarsely. "There's something looking in." We all turned toward the window. The curtains were open, and in the bright moonlight, we could see it clearly. Pressed against the glass was a face, but not a human face. It had a long, dog-like snout, but no fur. Its skin was a sickly dark gray-blue color, hairless and shiny with what looked like slime or mucus. Its eyes were the worst part, small, beady, and completely black, like empty holes. They darted frantically between each of us. None of us could move. We just stood there, staring at this thing as it stared back at us. Then its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-like teeth, and it pressed one of its hands against the glass. It had hands, human-shaped hands with long, tapered fingers ending in sharp black claws. But they weren't human hands. The skin had that same gray-blue color and shiny texture. "What the fuck is that?" Peter finally choked out. At the sound of his voice, the creature jerked back from the window, and then, impossibly, it began to move sideways and down, like it was climbing down the sheer outer wall of the house. But it wasn't climbing in any normal way. It was moving like a spider, its limbs bending at impossible angles, its body twisting unnaturally as it scuttled down the wall on all fours. Eric ran to the window and looked down. "Holy shit," he gasped. "It's running into the woods." In the moonlight, we could see it racing across the yard on all fours, but not like a dog or wolf. Its front limbs were longer than its back ones, and it ran with a horrible, loping gait, somehow both animal and human at the same time. It disappeared into the trees within seconds. None of us slept the rest of the night. We huddled in the living room, all the lights on, taking turns watching the windows and doors. Nobody talked much about what we'd seen. It was like we couldn't process it enough to put it into words. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, we started packing our stuff. Nobody mentioned staying the full weekend. We all just silently agreed we were getting the hell out of there. As I was throwing my bags into my car, I noticed something in the dirt of the driveway. Footprints, but not human ones, and not animal tracks either. They were like handprints with long finger marks, mixed with what looked like paw prints, forming a bizarre four-legged pattern. And there were multiple sets, heading off in different directions into the forest. We were on the road within 20 minutes, each of us in our separate cars, speeding down that dirt road like the devil himself was chasing us. None of us said goodbye or talked about where we were going. We just left. I drove straight home, locked all my doors and windows, and drank until I passed out on my couch. The next day, I called the owner of the lake house to tell them we had left early, half expecting them to ask why. But they just acknowledged the message, and that was it. No questions, no surprise, nothing. It's been 8 months now. We've all talked about it since then, trying to make sense of what we saw. Jimmy thinks it was some kind of escaped experiment, like something from a government lab. Peter thinks it was a person in some kind of costume trying to scare us away. Eric refuses to talk about it at all anymore. Me? I don't know what it was. But I know it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever seen or heard of. Sometimes I find myself looking up rare skin conditions or deformities online, trying to convince myself it could have been a person. But then I remember those eyes, those empty black eyes, and the way it moved down the side of the house like gravity didn't apply to it. We haven't done another trip since then. I don't think we ever will, and I know one thing for certain. I'm never renting a house near a forest again. Not for any price. I've been debating whether or not to share this for a long time. Even now, typing this out makes my hands shake. Some things from my childhood still haunt me, but nothing compares to what happened in the Badlands. This is all completely true, though I wish it wasn't. I grew up on the Navajo reservation near the Chaco Wash area. It's remote, beautiful in its own harsh way, but there are places there you shouldn't go. My grandmother made sure we understood that from an early age. Particularly, we were never ever allowed to go to her brother's property. It sat right on the edge of the Badlands, just a small plot with a run-down shack where he lived alone. My grandmother would always say, "That place is evil. The land is poisoned. Stay away." We didn't question it much as kids. The reservation has plenty of areas considered taboo or dangerous for spiritual reasons. But this was different. It wasn't just a warning about respecting sacred places. My grandmother was genuinely afraid of that spot. Her brother, my great-uncle, was strange. He kept to himself mostly, would sometimes disappear for days. He had this intense stare that made me uncomfortable as a child. I only met him a handful of times, but each time I felt like he was looking right through me. When I was 13, we got news that he had died. The circumstances were bizarre. No one had seen him for almost a week, and when someone finally checked on him, they found him dead in his house. What was really unusual was how quickly everything happened after that. Normally in Navajo tradition, we wait 4 days after someone dies before the funeral. It's important for the spirit to have time to journey to the afterlife. But my grandmother insisted on burying him immediately. She wouldn't explain why, just that it had to be done. Before they tore down his shack, which my grandmother also insisted on, I snuck inside. I know it was disrespectful, but I was a curious teenager, and something about all the secrecy made me want to understand what the big deal was. The place was simple, just one room with a bed, table, chair, and wood stove. There were some shearing tools, a couple of knives hanging on the wall, and 2 crates in the corner. One was open and had some clothes in it. The other was metal with a heavy padlock. I tried to open it but couldn't. When I asked my grandmother about it later, she just got this distant look in her eyes and said she'd had it buried with the house remains. Life went on. I grew up, went to college off the reservation, and kind of forgot about the whole thing for about 10 years. Then my uncle, my mom's brother, decided he wanted to build a house. He'd done well for himself working in oil, had some money, and wanted a nice place back on the reservation. Somehow he ended up buying that exact plot of land where my great-uncle's shack had been. When my grandmother found out, she was furious. "That land is cursed," she told him. "Nothing good will come from building there." But my uncle wasn't traditional. He laughed it off, said those were just old superstitions, and started construction anyway. That's when things started getting weird. The construction workers kept reporting problems. Tools would disappear, only to show up in completely different places days later. They'd leave the site clean at the end of the day and return in the morning to find everything rearranged. One worker quit after claiming he saw shadows moving inside the half-built house when no one was there. As the house got closer to completion, things escalated. They'd find smears of what looked like blood on the newly painted walls. No one could explain where it came from. The foreman called my uncle about strange tracks they kept finding in the sand around the property each morning. They led from the Badlands right up to the house. He said even the hunters on his crew couldn't identify what kind of animal made them. They weren't coyote or cougar or anything they recognized. My grandmother wasn't surprised. She said it was a skinwalker, Yi-Nald-Lushi. In our culture, they're evil witches who can transform into animals by wearing their skins. She told my uncle to put cedar around the property line, to keep a fire going at night, and never to leave the windows open after dark. My uncle humored her, but I could tell he didn't really believe it. The house was finally finished, a modern ranch-style place with 3 bedrooms, completely out of place in that remote area. My uncle moved in with his wife and their 2 kids. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. Then the disturbances started again. They'd hear footsteps on the roof at night. The kids would wake up screaming about someone standing at the foot of their beds. My aunt found deep scratches on the outside of the house each morning, like something was trying to claw its way in. I visited them about a month after they'd moved in. I brought my 2 cousins from my mom's side, and we planned to stay the weekend. The first night was tense. My uncle tried to act normal, but I could see how on edge everyone was. My aunt kept looking out the windows, and my uncle's kids stayed huddled together in the living room instead of playing in their rooms like normal. After dinner, my uncle told us not to go outside after dark, no matter what we heard. Sometimes there are noises, he said casually, like it was just wildlife. Better to stay inside. Around midnight, I was still awake in the guest room when I heard it, a scratching at the walls. Not like branches from a tree, but deliberate, like fingernails dragging across the outside of the house, moving slowly around the perimeter. Then came a sound I can only describe as a whisper howl. It was like someone was trying to call out names, but their voice was mixed with an animal's growl. I was frozen in my bed, too terrified to move. The sound circled the house 3 times before stopping right outside my window. I could hear breathing, heavy, wet breathing. Something scraped against the glass, and I swear I saw the window fog up like something was pressing its face against it. My youngest cousin, who was only 8, was staying in the kids' room. In the morning, she told us she'd seen someone watching her through the window. She described a person with pale, leathery skin and eyes like empty holes. She said it smiled at her with teeth like a coyote, but too many of them. We all tried to tell her it was just a nightmare, but she was adamant. It wasn't outside looking in, she insisted. It was inside the glass, like it was trapped in it. When my uncle heard this, something changed in his face. He called my grandmother that day. I overheard parts of the conversation. He was asking her for help. My grandmother was known in our community as a medicine woman. She used sacred crystals for healing and could locate missing people. She wasn't a full hatali, medicine man, but she knew the old ways and the prayers. She agreed to come, but said she'd bring a more powerful medicine man with her. They arrived the next day. The medicine man was elderly, with deep lines in his face and hands that looked like they'd seen a century of work. He walked through the house first, just feeling the energy, not saying much. My grandmother followed, burning sage and cedar. When they got to the master bedroom, both of them stopped abruptly. The medicine man started gagging, then vomited right there on the floor. Blood was coming from his nose. My grandmother got dizzy and had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. They hurried out of the room, and the medicine man insisted everyone leave the house immediately. We all went outside while he performed a cleansing ritual. Hours later, he came out looking exhausted. He told us he needed to go back in alone, just to the master bedroom. My uncle tried to argue, but the medicine man was firm. He was in there for almost an hour. When he finally emerged, his face was ashen. He sat down heavily on the front steps and asked for water. After drinking, he explained what he'd found. In the master bedroom closet, there was something wrong with the floor. He described it as a black swirling mist, like looking down at a hurricane from above. Just a small circle, maybe the size of a dinner plate, but completely black and moving constantly. He said it was a portal, opened by someone who knew old, forbidden magic. Your uncle, he said to my grandmother, was practicing things he shouldn't have. According to the medicine man, my great-uncle had been experimenting with dark ceremonies, trying to gain power. Whatever he'd summoned or created was still there, anchored to that spot. The medicine man had tried to close it using sacred prayers and offerings, but something strange happened. As he worked, he heard a voice coming from the darkness. It told him that only the one who opened the door could close it. Since my great-uncle was dead, the portal couldn't be completely sealed. The medicine man said he'd diminished its power for now, bound it so it couldn't fully manifest, but he warned that it wouldn't hold forever. Whatever was summoned is too strong to be controlled, he told my uncle. It consumed the one who called it. Now it waits for another. His recommendation was clear: abandon the house, tear it down, salt the earth. My uncle, who had spent his savings on this place, refused. He said he'd find another way, maybe bring in a priest from the Catholic Church in Gallup or some other spiritual leader who could help. I left the next day, thoroughly freaked out, but trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was mass hysteria, I told myself. Maybe the house was built on old burial grounds and we were just spooked. My aunt and uncle stayed, but things got worse. They separated the following month. My aunt took the kids and moved to her mother's place in Farmington. She told my mom that the final straw was when something crawled into bed with them in the middle of the night. My uncle felt it pressing down on the mattress, moving between them. Then it started choking him. When my aunt turned on the light, there was nothing there, but my uncle had bruises on his neck. My uncle stayed in the house alone for 2 more weeks before he finally gave up. He moved into a trailer in Shiprock and tried to sell the house, but no one would buy it. About 6 months later, 2 guys from a paranormal investigation show heard about the house and got permission from my uncle to check it out. They brought all kinds of equipment: EMF meters, night vision cameras, digital recorders. They didn't last 3 hours. One of them, a guy who'd investigated supposedly haunted places all over the country, told my uncle it was the most terrifying experience of his life. They encountered multiple spirits in the house: a little girl who kept asking them to come see, an old woman who screamed at them in Navajo, and something they couldn't see but could feel following them from room to room. The breaking point came when they entered the master bedroom. One of them saw a figure standing in the closet, tall, humanoid, but with no face, just smooth skin where features should be. It stepped out toward them, and both men ran. They left most of their equipment behind, too scared to go back for it. The house has been abandoned ever since. My uncle still technically owns it, but he never goes there. No one does. Sometimes people driving by at night report seeing lights on in the windows, even though the electricity was cut off years ago. Others say they've seen the curtains draw open, like someone inside is looking out. My grandmother passed away last year. Before she died, I asked her about my great-uncle and what really happened. She was weak, but she took my hand firmly and said, "Some doors should never be opened." He thought he could control what came through, but it controlled him instead. It's still there, waiting. Stay away from that place. I've kept my promise. I won't go near that house or the badlands around it. Sometimes I dream about that metal crate with the padlock, the one my grandmother had buried with the house remains. I wonder what was in it, and I'm grateful I never found out. The land there is sick. Whatever my great-uncle summoned is still waiting, and I don't think it's ever going to leave. I still get goosebumps writing this. I've been hesitant to share my experience for years, but I need to get this off my chest. What happened in San Jose Paso Nuevo haunts me to this day, and no matter how much time passes, I can't forget what I saw that night near La Cofre de Perote. I moved to this small town in Veracruz, Mexico, about 5 years ago for work at a local government agriculture office. The community was tight-knit, mostly farmers and ranchers living modest lives. Everyone knew each other, which made the strange events that followed even more disturbing. It started with whispers about missing animals. At first, it seemed like normal predator issues: coyotes or mountain lions taking a chicken or goat occasionally. But by my 3rd month there, the disappearances had become alarming. We're talking entire groups of animals vanishing overnight: goats, sheep, chickens. even a couple of young cows. For these families, losing livestock wasn't just an inconvenience. It was devastating financially. Most households depended on these animals for their livelihood. My friend Miguel lost 5 goats in a single night. The weird part? No blood, no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from his property. Just gone. The police came, looked around, and basically shrugged. This pattern repeated throughout the village over the next few weeks. The situation reached a breaking point when Humberto Rodriguez, who owned the largest farm on the eastern edge of town, closest to the mountain, lost 35 animals in less than 2 months. I remember sitting with him at the local cantina as he calculated his losses, nearly 80,000 pesos worth of livestock, a fortune in our small community. The man looked defeated, aged 10 years in weeks. What rattled everyone was what his wife, Lucia, claimed to have seen. She was hanging laundry late one afternoon when she spotted something perched on their property wall, a concrete fence about 3 meters high. She described it as dog-like, but wrong somehow. When she walked closer, it jumped off the wall and disappeared, but the jump was impossibly high and far. No normal dog could have made that leap. Humberto became desperate. He announced a reward of 20,000 pesos to whoever could catch or kill whatever was taking his animals. For context, that's nearly 3 months' salary for most people in town. This wasn't just about the money anymore. People were becoming genuinely scared. I volunteered to help guard Humberto's property, not just for the reward, but because I was honestly curious and concerned. 6 of us gathered that night, me, Humberto, his brother-in-law Carlos, and 3 other men from town. We positioned ourselves around his property, armed with shotguns and rifles. I was stationed near the main goat pen with Carlos. We'd been keeping watch for hours, drinking coffee to stay alert. Around 1:30 a.m., I noticed something weird. 2 of the guys who were watching the perimeter hadn't checked in for a while. I radioed Humberto, who went to check on them. When he came back, his face was pale. Both men were slumped against the fence, completely unconscious but physically fine. We couldn't wake them, no matter what we tried. That's when we heard it, a weird scratching sound, like nails on concrete, coming from the direction of the mountain. Carlos gripped his rifle tighter, and I felt my mouth go dry. The night was clear with a nearly full moon, giving us decent visibility across the property. I'll never forget what came next. Movement caught my eye, something gray approaching the fence from the direction of Cofre de Perote. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved deliberately, crouched low to the ground. It was about 1.5 meters tall in that position, moving in a way that made my skin crawl. Not quite like a person or an animal, but something in between. When it reached the fence, it stood upright, and that's when my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The thing was thin, unnaturally so, with gray skin covered in patchy short fur. Its arms were too long for its body, ending in hands with claws that had to be 10-15 centimeters long. But it was the face that made my blood freeze. It had completely white eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight, only one ear that I could see, and its jaw was slight, with veins or tendons visible beneath the skin. Carlos started praying under his breath. I tried to raise my rifle but found myself completely frozen. It wasn't normal fear. It was like my body had simply stopped responding to my brain. I couldn't even scream. The creature leapt over the 3-meter fence in a single bound, landing silently in the goat pen. The goats, which should have panicked, just stood there, equally paralyzed. It grabbed 2 young goats, one under each arm, and jumped back over the fence like it weighed nothing. That's when Humberto started firing. The spell broke for me too, and I raised my gun. But when I pulled the trigger, nothing happened. The gun had jammed. Same with Carlos's. Humberto was the only one whose weapon worked, but his shots seemed to miss despite him being an excellent marksman. The creature took off toward the mountain with incredible speed, the goats now bleating in terror. Somehow this snapped us all into action. We ran to Humberto's truck and gave chase, following the sounds of the distressed animals. Carlos and Humberto were on horseback and moved ahead faster, while I followed in the truck with the others. By the time we caught up, Carlos and Humberto were standing at the base of a rocky section of the mountain, staring at what appeared to be a cave entrance. I'd hiked around this area before and never noticed any cave here. Carlos swore the creature had entered it, the goat still alive under its arms. None of us were brave enough to follow it inside. We decided to keep watch until dawn, when Humberto radioed for more help from the village. By morning, about 20 men had gathered, along with Father Domingo, the town priest. The priest insisted on blessing the cave entrance before anyone went inside. As he began his prayers, sprinkling holy water on the rocks, we heard something that made my heart stop. A man crying from deep within the cave. It wasn't animal sounds or an echo. It was distinctly human sobbing. Father Domingo's face hardened. "Do not listen," he warned us. "This is the Nagual trying to trick us." I'd heard stories about the Nagual growing up, shape-shifting witches from Mexican folklore who could transform into animals. But those were just old tales told to frighten children, or so I thought. The priest continued his blessing, and as he finished, the crying changed to something worse, horrible screams and curses in Spanish, threatening to kill everyone in the village. The voice didn't sound human anymore. Father Domingo instructed us to seal the cave. We spent hours piling rocks in front of the entrance. The priest placed crosses made of palm leaves blessed during Palm Sunday around the sealed entrance and sprinkled more holy water before drawing symbols I didn't recognize in the dirt. "Do not return here," he warned as we finished. "Do not remove these stones." We thought that would be the end of it. We were wrong. 3 days later, a woman arrived in town with a baby strapped to her chest. She was asking everyone if they had seen her husband, a man named Emmanuel who bought and sold animals throughout the region. She said he was from Tonalco, a village about 20 kilometers away. According to her, he had started a business with a friend several months ago, traveling between villages to buy livestock, and their financial situation had improved dramatically since then. The timing lined up perfectly with when our animals started disappearing. She mentioned he would often be gone for days, supposedly traveling to different markets. When she described him, several people exchanged knowing glances. Nobody told her about the cave or our suspicions, but after she left, the whispers began. Had her husband been the Nagual? Had we sealed a man inside that cave? Some wanted to check the cave to see if perhaps we had made a terrible mistake. Father Domingo forbade it, warning that this too could be part of the Nagual's trickery. That night, strange things began happening in the village. People reported hearing scratching on their roofs and walls. Black birds appeared, perching on rooftops and staring at people with unnaturally focused attention. A putrid smell like rotting meat would appear and disappear in different parts of town. Most disturbing were the reports of seeing a man in black walking toward the mountain at dusk. The next 2 weeks were hell. I couldn't sleep. When I did, I dreamed of white eyes watching me from the darkness. The whole town was on edge. 3 more animals disappeared, though not in the numbers we had seen before. One night, I woke to scratching at my window. When I gathered the courage to look, there was nothing there, but on the glass were marks that looked like they had been made by large claws sliding down the surface. I left San Jose Paso Nuevo the following week, moving to Poza Rica where I found a new job. I've never gone back, though I stay in touch with Carlos. He tells me things eventually calmed down, but no one in the village goes near that part of the mountain anymore. The woman with the baby returned once more, this time with police, but they found nothing. No evidence of anyone being trapped in a cave, mainly because they couldn't find the cave at all. The entrance we had sealed seemed to have vanished completely. I know how this sounds. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I'd think it was just a story. But there are at least 20 people in San Jose Paso Nuevo who saw what I saw that night. Something was hunting in our village, something that wasn't human or animal, but somehow both. I've researched naguals extensively since then. The legends say they're humans who can transform into animals, usually at night, to feed or steal. Some versions claim they can be killed normally in their animal form, but we certainly couldn't harm the one we encountered. Sometimes I wonder about that woman and her baby. Did she know what her husband was? Was she part of it somehow? Or was she just an innocent victim in all this, someone who lost her husband to our fears and superstitions? I don't have answers. All I know is what I saw, and what I saw that night at Cofre de Perot defies any rational explanation I've been able to come up with. I still check my windows for scratch marks every morning, and I never ever stay out after dark if I can help it. Last week I received a text from Carlos that simply said, "Birds are back." I haven't heard from him since. I'm trying to convince myself to check on him, but the thought of returning to San Jose Paso Nuevo fills me with dread I can't overcome. Whatever was in that cave, I fear it's not finished with the village yet. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I swear I can hear scratching outside my apartment here in Poza Rica, over 100 kilometers away from Cofre de Perot. I've never shared this publicly before. I'm still not sure I should, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. Maybe I'm not alone. I grew up on the Navajo Reservation in Arizona. Beautiful land, but there's a heaviness there that's hard to explain to outsiders. My family has lived there for generations. We know the stories, the traditions, the warnings. But knowing about something and experiencing it firsthand are two very different things. It started with my dad's experience about 15 years ago. He wasn't one to talk about spiritual stuff much. He was practical, grounded. So when he finally told me what happened that day, I knew it was serious. He'd been out hunting early one morning in late October. The sun wasn't up yet, and there was that pre-dawn chill that cuts right through your clothes. He was walking along an old dirt road that cuts through a section of juniper trees. He said he felt it before he saw anything, this overwhelming sense of dread that made the hair on his arms stand up. It felt like someone was walking right behind me, he told me, but not something. He turned around, expecting to see another hunter maybe, or even a coyote. Instead, he saw what he described as a dark mass. Not quite human-shaped, but not animal either. Just darkness, denser than the shadows around it. It was like looking at a hole in the world, he said. His voice got real quiet when he talked about it, and it was aware of me. He stood there, frozen. The thing didn't move toward him, but he felt it watching. After what seemed like forever, but was probably just seconds, it seemed to dissolve into the darkness. Dad said he felt sick afterward, like something had been taken from him. He finished his hunting trip early and came home. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen, not even my mom. The next morning, we got the call. His younger brother, my Uncle Aaron, had hanged himself from a cottonwood tree behind his house sometime during the night. Uncle Aaron had struggled with drinking for years, but things had seemed better lately. He'd been sober for almost 6 months. No one saw it coming. It wasn't until after the funeral that Dad connected what he'd seen with what happened. He mentioned it to one of the elders, who nodded knowingly. "The shadow comes before the darkness takes our people," the elder told him. "It's been happening more and more." That conversation opened the floodgates. Suddenly we were hearing similar stories from all over the reservation. A cousin who saw a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed 3 days before her husband took a bottle of pills. A neighbor who felt something cold brush past him in an empty hallway the night before his teenage daughter slit her wrists in the bathtub. These shadows, these beings, as some call them, they seem to appear right before someone loses hope completely. They're like harbingers, but the elders say it's more than that. They think these things don't just predict the suicides, they influence them. I didn't really believe it at first. I'd grown up with my feet in two worlds, the traditional ways of my people and the modern, scientific approach I learned in school. I leaned more towards science, honestly. Mental health issues, addiction, generational trauma, these were real problems with real explanations. Shadow beings seemed like a way to make sense of senseless tragedies. Then I saw one myself. I was 19, home from college for winter break. My cousin Layla had been staying with us. She'd had a rough year, lost her job, broke up with her boyfriend, started drinking heavily. My parents took her in to keep an eye on her. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. Our house was small, just a single story with 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom off the main hallway. As I walked down the hall, I noticed Layla's door was open a crack. I glanced in as I passed, just to check on her. She was asleep, but she wasn't alone. Standing at the foot of her bed was a figure that made my blood freeze. It was like Dad described, darker than the darkness around it. It had a vaguely human shape, but proportions that were just wrong. Too tall, arms too long. And though it had no face that I could see, I knew it was looking at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. It was like time stopped. Then it shifted, not walking but sort of gliding, toward the corner of the room and seemed to melt into the wall. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. Finally, I managed to move my legs. I ran to my parents' room, woke them up, told them what I'd seen. Dad's face went pale. Mom started crying. We woke Layla up immediately. She was groggy, annoyed at being disturbed. Dad called one of the medicine men right then, despite the hour. By sunrise, the medicine man was at our house, preparing for a cleansing ceremony. Layla complained the whole time, said we were overreacting, but she went through with it anyway. The ceremony lasted all day. I won't share the details. Some things are private to our traditions, but by the end, even Layla seemed affected. The medicine man gave her a small pouch to wear and specific instructions about prayers and thoughts. 2 days later, she told us she'd been planning to kill herself the night I saw the shadow. She'd hidden pills she'd been collecting for weeks. She was going to wait until everyone was asleep, then take them all at once. But after the ceremony, she said, it was like a fog had lifted. She could suddenly see beyond her pain. That was my first encounter, but not my last. Over the next few years, I saw them 3 more times. Each time, we were able to intervene. Each time the person admitted later they'd been planning to end their life. The elders have a theory about these shadow beings. They say they feed on negative energy, on pain and despair. The reservation has plenty of that. Generations of trauma, poverty, addiction. It's like a buffet for them. They attach themselves to vulnerable people, people who are already using substances or other means to numb their pain. They whisper hopelessness into their ears until death seems like the only escape. What's most terrifying is that they seem to pass from person to person, especially within families. After my uncle died, the shadow that Dad saw seemed to move through our extended family like a curse. First Uncle Aaron, then his daughter almost, then Layla, then others, always following the paths of connection, especially where pain already exists. After my third encounter, one of the elders suggested I document everything I could remember about each experience. He believed understanding their pattern might help prevent future tragedies. I noticed they're drawn to certain places too. There's an area about 2 miles from our home where several suicides have occurred over the decades. The elders call it a place of bad medicine. Something terrible happened there long ago, a story I'm not at liberty to share, and the land still carries that energy. These shadow beings seem to congregate in such places, waiting for vulnerable people to pass by. Last summer, my youngest brother started showing signs of depression. He'd just turned 18, was uncertain about his future, and had started hanging out with a crowd that drank heavily. One night, I woke up with that familiar feeling of dread. I knew before I even opened my eyes that there was a shadow being in my room. This one was different, though. It seemed stronger, more defined. As I watched, frozen under my covers, it moved to my bedroom door, then looked back at me. Again, no face, but I could feel its attention before disappearing into the hallway. I knew instantly it was heading for my brother's room. Despite the terror gripping me, I forced myself to move. I ran to his room and burst through the door without knocking. The shadow was there, now standing over my brother's sleeping form. Without thinking, I started reciting the prayers the medicine man had taught me years before. The shadow being seemed to recoil. It moved away from the bed toward the window. I kept praying, my voice gaining strength. And then, something I'd never seen before, it seemed to shatter, like black glass breaking into 1,000 pieces before disappearing completely. I woke my brother immediately. He was confused, annoyed at first, but when I told him what I'd seen, something in his eyes confirmed my fears. He broke down crying, admitted he'd been planning to drive to that place of bad medicine the next day and end his life there. We took him to the medicine man that morning. The ceremony was more intensive than any I'd witnessed before. It lasted 3 days. The medicine man explained that these shadow beings can be defeated, but only through the strength of our traditions and ceremonies. Modern medicine has its place. My brother also started seeing a therapist at the Indian Health Service clinic. But for this specific threat, our ancient ways are the most effective defense. I'm 27 now. I've seen these shadow beings 6 times in total. Each time we've been able to prevent tragedy. I keep traditional medicine from the elders in my room, a small pouch of herbs and other sacred items, and I've learned the prayers and songs that seem to repel these entities. But I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, feeling watched. The reservation's suicide rate is still far too high. For every person we save, others slip through the cracks. People who don't believe, or whose families don't recognize the signs, or who live too far from a medicine man to get help in time. I've talked to healthcare workers on the reservation about what I've seen. Most dismiss it as superstition, but a few, especially the Navajo nurses and doctors. Listen, some have even started asking patients if they've seen shadows or felt unusual presences. It's not in any medical textbook, but they've noticed the correlation too. The hardest part is explaining this to outsiders. How do you tell someone that there are literal shadow beings that precede suicide without sounding crazy? How do you explain that generational trauma creates spiritual vulnerabilities that these entities exploit? It sounds like a horror movie, not real life, but it is real, at least for us here. The shadows are real. Their connection to suicide is real. And the pain they leave behind in families like mine is devastatingly real. Last week, I thought I saw one again, just a glimpse out of the corner of my eye near my cousin's new baby's crib. My blood ran cold, but when I looked directly, nothing was there. Still, I didn't take chances. I performed the cleansing ritual myself, blessed the baby and the room. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my fear playing tricks on me. Or maybe these shadow beings are now targeting the most vulnerable among us before they even have a chance to grow up. I don't know if sharing this will help anyone. Maybe someone else has seen them too. Maybe there are similar entities in other cultures, other places with deep historical trauma. All I know is that awareness has saved lives in my community. If you ever see a shadow darker than darkness, moving with purpose, filling you with inexplicable dread, don't ignore it. Don't rationalize it away. It might not be your imagination, and someone's life might depend on what you do next. I wish I could explain it all. I wish I could prove it. But some things exist in the spaces between what we can prove and what we know to be true. I just know what I've seen, and I know that every time we've acted on these sightings, we've prevented a death. That's all the proof I need. I've never really talked about this outside of my family and a few close friends. But I think I need to get this off my chest finally. It's been almost 18 years now, but I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that summer night at the radio station. Back in 2005, I had just started volunteering at our local radio station on the Navajo reservation. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small building with a couple of studios, a lobby, kitchen area, and some offices. The main studio faced the front entrance, which I later realized was probably not the best setup. That Monday in mid-July was brutally hot, even for the reservation. I remember showing up around 6:30 p.m. to help my friend Marcus with his evening show. Marcus had been DJing there for a couple of years and was teaching me the ropes. The station manager had left earlier, so it was just the two of us that evening. The first thing I noticed when I walked in was how stuffy it felt inside. The air conditioning had broken down again, a common occurrence that summer. So Marcus had propped open both the front entrance door and the inner lobby door to create some airflow. It helped a little, but the place was still uncomfortably warm. "Sorry about the heat," Marcus said when I walked in. "At least we've got cold drinks in the fridge." For the next hour, I mostly observed as Marcus ran his show, playing a mix of traditional native music and contemporary stuff. He was popular with listeners and got quite a few call-ins. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the windows. Around 7:30, during a string of songs Marcus had queued up, I needed to use the bathroom. "I'll be right back," I told him as he adjusted some levels on the board. The bathroom was toward the back of the building, past the kitchen area. I had to walk down a short hallway with windows that faced the east side of the property. It was getting darker outside, but there was still enough daylight to see clearly. That's when I first saw it. As I was walking down the hallway, something caught my eye through the window. a figure walking slowly past. It was wearing dark clothes with what looked like a hoodie pulled up. Something about the way it moved felt wrong, not normal, like each step was too measured, too deliberate. I stopped walking, and that's when the figure turned its head toward the window, toward me. I couldn't see a face under that hood, just darkness. But I knew it was looking directly at me. The feeling that washed over me is hard to describe. It was like all the warmth drained from my body in an instant. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up. My stomach clenched like someone had punched me. And in my head, my first thought wasn't fear or confusion. It was resignation. Not again. See, this wasn't my first experience with something unexplainable. Growing up on the reservation, I'd had encounters before. Things my grandmother had tried to help me understand and protect me from. But I'd never felt anything this intense, this malevolent. The figure stayed there for what felt like forever, but was probably just a few seconds, then turned and continued walking, disappearing from view. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I quickly used the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and tried to calm down. When I got back to the studio, Marcus was still sitting at the control board, looking at some CDs. "Hey, did you see anyone outside when you came in?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "No, why?" He looked up with mild interest. "I just saw someone walking past the side window, wearing a dark hoodie." Marcus frowned. "Probably just someone cutting through the property, but we should check it out." We went outside together, walking around the entire building. The evening air had cooled slightly, but I still felt uncomfortably hot. Probably from the adrenaline. We didn't find anyone. The station was somewhat isolated, with the nearest building being about a quarter-mile away, and there were no cars in the parking lot except ours. "Weird," Marcus said as we headed back inside. "You sure it wasn't just a shadow or something?" I shook my head. No, it was definitely a person, or something that looked like a person. Marcus gave me a look I'd seen before. That, "Are you going to get all superstitious on me?" look. But then his expression changed. "You know, weird stuff does happen here sometimes," he admitted as we walked back to the studio. Equipment turning on by itself. Voices when nobody's around. I usually just ignore it. For the next hour, everything was normal. I helped answer a few listener calls. Marcus taught me more about the equipment, and I almost convinced myself I'd overreacted earlier. Almost. It was around 9:15 p.m. when I looked up and saw it again. This time, it was at the front entrance, standing just outside the propped-open door, looking in. The same dark hoodie, the same absence where a face should be. "Marcus," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figure, "look at the front door." He turned, squinting toward the entrance. "What am I looking at?" "You don't see someone standing there, in a dark hoodie?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "There's nobody there, man." I looked directly at the figure, and the moment I did, it vanished. Not like a person walking away. It literally disappeared. But I could still feel it, like a heaviness in the air, a pressure against my skin. "I think we should close the doors," I said, my mouth dry. Before Marcus could respond, movement caught my eye. The entity, I knew now it wasn't human, had reappeared at the lobby door about 20 feet from us. This time, I could see it more clearly. It was a full-bodied silhouette, completely black, with that hood still covering where its eyes should be. It seemed to be watching us, studying us. Fear exploded inside me, not the kind that makes you scream or run, the kind that paralyzes you. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. In my mind I was screaming, "Get out! over and over, directing all my energy at the shadow. And then something impossible happened. The black figure began to change shape. It lost its human form, transforming into what looked like a wispy black cloud or smoke. It hovered there for a moment, then flowed toward the kitchen area, disappearing around the corner. I realized I'd been holding my breath and gasped for air. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, looking genuinely concerned now. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "You really didn't see that?" My voice was shaking. "See what?" "There's nothing there." "There was something, a shadow person, right there in the doorway. Then it turned into like smoke and went toward the kitchen." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "I didn't see anything, but I felt something. Like when you walk into a room and know someone's there, even before you see them. That cold feeling on the back of your neck." We both went to check the kitchen area. The feeling of presence had vanished completely. The kitchen was empty, just the refrigerator humming, a microwave, some cabinets, and a small table with chairs. "Maybe we should close up early tonight," Marcus suggested, not looking at me directly. "Yeah," I agreed, feeling both relieved and unsettled that he believed me enough to suggest that. We closed and locked both doors, despite the heat. For the rest of his shift, I stayed right next to Marcus. We didn't talk much about what had happened, but I could tell he was shaken too, even though he hadn't seen what I had. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When we finally left around 11 p.m., I practically ran to my car. "You gonna be okay to come back Wednesday?" Marcus asked as we stood in the parking lot. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, but next time we keep the doors closed." Over the next few weeks, I continued volunteering at the station, but I was constantly on edge. I never saw the hooded figure again in that exact form, but strange things kept happening. Items would move when no one was looking. The temperature would suddenly drop in certain rooms. Once, I distinctly heard someone whisper my name when I was alone in the office. I finally told my grandmother about what had happened. She wasn't surprised. In our culture, we acknowledge these entities exist. She arranged for me to participate in a cleansing ceremony with some of our tribal elders. I won't go into the details of that. Some things are private to our traditions, but it helped. A few months after my encounter, the station management decided to renovate, moving the main studio to a smaller room that didn't face the front door directly. They never mentioned any supernatural reasons for the change, just better acoustics and more efficient use of space. But I always wondered if others had experiences they never talked about. I still volunteer at that radio station occasionally, though not as regularly as I used to. Sometimes I still feel uncomfortable there, especially at night. But I've never seen that hooded shadow figure again, not like I did that summer evening in 2005. What bothers me most, even now, is that first thought I had when I saw it. Not again. Like some part of me recognized what it was, like it had been looking for me specifically, or maybe I was just more sensitive to its presence than others. To this day, I don't know what it wanted or why it appeared to me. I don't know if it was something specific to that building or to the reservation, or if it was something attached to me personally. What I do know is that the boundary between our world and whatever exists beyond it is thinner than most people realize. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there at the station, watching, waiting. And sometimes, when I'm alone late at night and feel that familiar prickle on the back of my neck, I wonder if it followed me home. I've been sitting on this experience for almost a decade now, trying to convince myself that what happened to me in those woods near the Welsh border back in 2014 was just my imagination playing tricks. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And no matter how many times I've tried to rationalize it away, I can't. So I'm finally putting this down, hoping maybe someone else has encountered something similar. It was early May 2014, and I'd planned a 3-night solo camping trip in a remote wooded area. I wasn't at any designated campsite. This was proper wild camping where you're really on your own. I'd done plenty of solo trips before and always loved the solitude, the disconnect from everyday life, the quiet. The first day and a half went perfectly. Weather was decent for England in spring, not too cold, only a bit of drizzle on the first morning. I'd hiked about 7 miles that second day, found a nice clearing to set up camp, and spent the evening cooking some pasta on my portable stove. I remember feeling completely at peace, watching the sunset filter through the trees, thinking how this was exactly what I needed after months of stress at work. My tent was nothing fancy, just a simple 2-person dome tent that I'd used for years. I'd positioned it near the edge of the clearing with the entrance facing away from the forest's denser section. Around 10 p.m., I got into my sleeping bag with a couple of beers I'd packed in. Yeah, adding unnecessary weight to my pack, but worth it, and started reading a thriller I'd brought along. I must have dozed off around midnight after finishing my second beer. The book was still on my chest when I woke up to something. At first I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, humming. Not just random humming, but perfect, almost unnaturally precise humming. The tune wasn't familiar, but the execution was flawless. Not a single note out of place, no breaks for breath, nothing. It was like listening to some professional vocalist practicing scales, except there was something off about it. It had this hollow quality that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I froze in my sleeping bag, straining to listen. The sound was coming from about 50 feet away, somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing. My first thought was another camper, but I hadn't seen any signs of anyone else in the area during my hike. Plus, who wanders around humming in the woods at what must have been around 1 a.m.? I lay there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple of minutes, trying to convince myself it was just an unusual bird or some kind of natural phenomenon. The humming never faltered, never paused for breath. It maintained the same perfect pitch and rhythm continuously. Finally, I couldn't just lie there anymore. I needed to know what was making that sound. I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled toward the tent entrance, my heart hammering in my chest. I hesitated at the zipper, suddenly unsure if I really wanted to see what was out there. But curiosity won out. I slowly pulled the zipper down just enough to create a small opening and pressed my face against it, peering out into the darkness. The woods were dimly lit by a partial moon, creating odd shadows among the trees. The instant, and I mean the very instant, I opened that zipper, the humming stopped. Not faded out, not trailed off. Stopped, like someone had hit a mute button. The sudden silence was almost as unnerving as the humming had been. I waited, listening intently. Nothing. The forest was dead quiet. No wind, no animals, nothing. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound more annoyed than terrified. "If someone's out there fucking with me, it's not funny. Just leave me alone, all right?" No response, just more of that heavy, unnatural silence. I waited maybe 10 more seconds, listening. Nothing. I started to think maybe I dreamed the whole thing, or perhaps it had been some weird auditory hallucination brought on by the beers or exhaustion from hiking. I began to close the tent zipper, relieved that whatever it was had stopped. I was just about to zip it completely when the humming started again. This time it was loud, and close, and coming from the completely opposite direction from where I'd heard it before. My blood ran cold. There's no way, absolutely no way, that someone could have moved from the original spot to this new location in complete silence, especially through the underbrush, in those few seconds I was looking out. It was physically impossible. The new location was maybe 15 feet from my tent, close enough that I could clearly see it. I wish I could say it was just a person playing a prank. I wish I could say it was anything explainable. But what I saw standing there at the edge of the clearing, half illuminated by the moonlight, wasn't human. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. Its proportions were all wrong. The limbs were stretched too long, too thin, like someone had taken a human figure and pulled it like taffy. Its arms hung nearly to its knees, fingers elongated to the point of being almost twig-like. The torso was narrow, almost concave, and its head, its head was small and round, like a ball sitting atop this distorted frame. The skin, if you could call it that, was a dull grayish color, not like any human skin tone I've ever seen, more like ash or stone. I couldn't make out facial features clearly. They were obscured by shadow. But I had the distinct impression that its face wasn't right either. As I stood there, half in and half out of my tent, completely paralyzed with fear, the humming stopped. The silence hung in the air for maybe 2 seconds. Then it started speaking. Michael, my name. It was saying my fucking name. But the sound, Jesus Christ, the sound of it. It was my voice, my own voice, but with something terribly wrong about it. Like something was wearing my voice like an ill-fitting suit. The syllables were stretched and compressed in places where they shouldn't be, as if whatever was speaking didn't understand how human speech worked. Michael. I couldn't move. I literally could not make my body respond. I just stood there, watching this thing say my name in my own distorted voice. Then it took a step toward me. That broke the spell. Suddenly I could move again, and I did the only thing my brain could process. I ran. I didn't grab anything, didn't even put on shoes. I just bolted in the opposite direction, crashing through the underbrush in my socks and pajama pants. I ran blindly, branches whipping my face, rocks and sticks cutting into my feet through my socks. I had no idea where I was going, just away. Away from that thing, away from that voice. Eventually, I couldn't run anymore. My lungs were burning, my feet were in agony. I collapsed against a large tree, trying desperately to catch my breath without making noise. I sat there, curled up against the trunk, listening for any sign that the thing had followed me. For what felt like hours, I didn't move. Every small sound in the forest made me flinch. A branch breaking in the distance, an owl hooting, the rustle of leaves in the slight breeze that had picked up. Each time I was certain it was that thing coming for me. My phone was back in the tent, my car keys too. I had literally nothing with me except the clothes I was wearing. No light, no weapon, nothing. I was completely vulnerable. After what must have been about 2 hours of sitting there shaking, I realized I needed to get to my car. It was parked about a mile from my campsite at a small parking area for hikers, but to get to it, I'd need to go back to my tent for the keys. The thought of returning to that clearing made me physically ill. But what choice did I have? Stay in the woods until morning and then, what? Walk barefoot through miles of forest. I needed those keys, and I needed my phone. I tried to orient myself, figuring out which direction I'd come from. The sky had cleared somewhat, and I could use the position of the moon to get a rough sense of direction. Slowly, painfully, I began making my way back toward the clearing. Every step was agony on my torn-up feet. Every shadow looked like that elongated silhouette. I stopped constantly, listening for that perfect humming or the sound of my name being mangled by something inhuman. It took me over an hour to find my way back to the vicinity of my campsite. I approached with extreme caution, staying low and moving as quietly as possible. When I finally caught sight of my tent through the trees, I stopped and watched for several minutes, looking for any sign of the creature. Nothing moved. The clearing looked peaceful, almost ordinary in the moonlight. My tent was still there, exactly as I'd left it, entrance flap open from my hasty exit, but no sign of that thing. I waited longer, gathering my courage. Finally, I knew I had to make a move. I darted from my hiding spot, sprinted across the clearing, and dove into my tent. I grabbed my phone, car keys, and wallet, not bothering with anything else. Then I was out again, running at full speed toward the trail that would lead me back to the parking area. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My feet were bleeding through my socks. My lungs felt like they were going to explode, but the adrenaline kept me going. When I finally saw my old Vauxhall sitting there in the deserted parking area, I nearly cried with relief. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine, turning the heater on full blast. I was freezing, both from the night air and from pure terror. I sat there until sunrise, jumping at every sound, constantly checking the rearview mirror for any sign of that impossibly tall figure emerging from the tree line. When daylight finally came, I forced myself to go back for my gear. I couldn't afford to replace everything, and I figured in the light of day, with other hikers potentially around, it would be safer. The return to my campsite was uneventful, though I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time. My tent and all my gear were untouched. I packed everything up in record time and got the hell out of there. For weeks afterward, I had terrible nightmares. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking I heard humming outside my bedroom window. I took a break from camping for over 2 years after that. Even now, I won't camp alone anymore. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find any folklore or accounts of similar encounters in that region. I've found some vague references to tall ones or silent walkers in old Welsh mythology, but nothing that exactly matches what I saw. The thing that still haunts me the most, the thing I can't explain no matter how hard I try, is how it knew my name. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was camping. I hadn't spoken my name aloud at any point during the trip. There was absolutely no way for anything out there to know who I was. Yet it did, and it used my own voice to call to me. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't run. I don't want to know. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all just a vivid hallucination, maybe from something I ate or drank. But deep down, I know better. Whatever was in those woods that night wasn't human. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and the house is completely silent, I find myself listening for that perfect, unnatural humming to start again. I'm still shaking as I type this, and it's been nearly 40 years. I've never shared this story outside my family, but I need to get it out there. What happened to us shouldn't be brushed aside or forgotten. My parents, my 3 younger siblings, and I moved into our new house on the res back in 1983. I was 17 then. The whole community was excited about the new housing development, actual new houses being built for our people. The government had finally come through with funding after decades of broken promises. When we found out we'd been selected for one of the first homes, my mom cried. We'd been living in a 2-bedroom trailer with bad plumbing and worse insulation. The house was beautiful by our standards. 3 bedrooms, a full basement, modern kitchen. It sat on a piece of land at the edge of the development, right below a hill with pine-covered draws on both sides. Every morning, we'd watch the sunrise come up over the eastern draw. My dad said we had the best lot in the whole development. What we didn't know then was that our house sat directly on what used to be a game trail. Old people in the community had whispered about this being bad medicine, building houses where the animals had their paths, but nobody in charge listened. Progress was progress. The construction crew had problems from the start. Dad's cousin worked on the project and told us weird stuff kept happening. They'd leave on Friday with the basement dug out, come back Monday to find dirt pushed back in. They'd frame up walls, return to find lumber scattered. Tools would disappear. Most of the workers said it was just local kids messing around. Some of the older guys wouldn't say anything at all, just made signs to ward off evil when they thought nobody was looking. We moved in during October. The first few weeks were perfect. Then our dogs started acting strange. We had 2 mutts, Rusty, a big red shepherd mix, and Blue, a smaller black and white thing with some border collie in him. They'd always been good watchdogs, but they started barking like crazy every night around 11 p.m., always facing that eastern draw. Dad and I would go out with flashlights, and sometimes we'd catch glimpses of eyes reflecting back at us from the tree line. We figured it was deer or maybe coyotes. Nothing to worry about. Dad would yell, fire his shotgun into the air once in a while, and whatever it was would disappear back into the trees. By December, things were getting worse. The dogs wouldn't shut up at night. They'd bark until they were hoarse, and we'd find them exhausted in the morning. My youngest brother, who was only 6, started having nightmares about the tall man in the trees. My sister said she heard scratching on her bedroom window one night, but when Dad checked, there were no marks. Then came that night in January. Mom and Dad had taken my younger siblings to Rapid City for my brother's doctor appointment. They were going to stay overnight with my aunt because a storm was coming in. I stayed home to feed the dogs and catch up on schoolwork. The evening started normally enough. I heated up some leftover stew, did some homework, and watched TV. Around 10:30, I let the dogs out for their last bathroom break. They immediately started barking toward the eastern draw, which had become normal. I didn't think much of it, but then the barking changed. I've never heard anything like it before or since. It went from that challenging territorial bark to something higher-pitched, panicked. Rusty, the bigger dog, started yelping like something had hurt him bad. Then I heard a thump against the side of the house, like something heavy had been thrown against it. I turned off the TV. The house went quiet, except for Blue still barking frantically out front. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and Dad's rifle from the cabinet. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I got to the kitchen door, I hesitated. Blue had gone quiet too. Complete silence. I switched on the porch light, but it only illuminated about 10 feet out from the house, and beyond that was pitch black. I unlocked the door, then stood there listening for a good minute. That's when I heard it, a soft shuffling sound coming from the direction of the eastern draw. Slow, deliberate footsteps crushing the frozen snow. They weren't animal footsteps. They were too heavy, too measured. I opened the door just enough to stick my flashlight through. When I pointed it toward the draw, the beam caught movement about 35 yards away, right at the top where the trees began. I still remember exactly how far it was, because my dad had set up a target there for shooting practice. What I saw wasn't a deer or a coyote. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was standing upright at the edge of the trees, tall, impossibly tall. When my flashlight beam hit it, the thing raised an arm to shield its eyes. An arm, not a paw. Its skin looked dark, but not black, more like a deep rusty brown. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I saw enough to know it wasn't human. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then backed away until I hit the kitchen counter. For a few seconds, there was silence again. Then I heard it, a scream that started low and rose to a pitch that made my ears hurt. It came from behind the house, then abruptly stopped. A moment later, another scream erupted right outside the kitchen door, so close it sounded like whatever made it had its mouth pressed against the wood. I heard Blue barking frantically at the front of the house, then a yelp and a thud like he'd been picked up and thrown. After that, the banging started. Heavy, deliberate blows against the walls of the house. First at the back, then the sides, then the front. It was like the thing was circling us, testing for a way in. Between the bangs, I heard a deep, guttural growling, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I ran to my parents' bedroom, which was furthest from any exterior walls, and huddled on their bed with the rifle. I was too terrified to even cry or scream. I just sat there shaking as the pounding continued around the house. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably about 20 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The last sound was another of those screams, this time from the southeast corner of the house. Then silence. I sat frozen for what must have been another 10 minutes. The house heating system kicked on, making me jump. Slowly, I got up and moved to my bedroom, which faced the backyard. I was drawn to the window by some force I can't explain. Like when you're watching a horror movie and you know the character shouldn't go investigate the noise, but they always do. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out. The moon had come out from behind the clouds, casting an eerie blue light over our backyard. And there it was, standing in the middle of the yard, looking up at the house. We had a clothesline pole that was about 5.5 feet tall. This thing stood at least 2.5 feet taller than that pole. Its arms hung almost to its knees. Its body was thin but looked powerful, like a distance runner's. I still couldn't see its face clearly, just that it had a pronounced brow and what looked like a shallow muzzle. It must have sensed me watching, because it suddenly turned its head and looked directly at my window. I ducked down, but it was too late. I heard it moving, fast, the snow crunching under its feet as it ran back toward the eastern draw. When I dared to look again, I saw it had stopped at the edge of the trees, and it was looking back at the house, at my window. At that exact moment, headlights swept across the yard as my parents' car turned into our driveway. The lights briefly illuminated the creature before it disappeared into the trees. In that flash, I saw its eyes reflect back the light like an animal's would, and I saw its mouth open in what might have been a snarl or a smile. I ran to the front door to meet my parents, nearly hysterical. Dad didn't believe me at first, thought I'd been watching scary movies and worked myself up. But then we couldn't find the dogs. The next morning, we went out to look around. The snow told the story my words couldn't. All around the house were tracks. Tracks like bare human feet, but huge, at least 14 inches long. We measured them. They circled the entire house, exactly matching the pattern of the banging I'd heard. On the sides of the house, about 7 feet up, were dusty handprints with long fingers. Dad is 6'2", and he had to stretch to touch them. The wood siding was scuffed and scratched in places like something with claws had been testing it. Then we found Rusty, or what was left of him. He was on the roof of the house. The roof. Something had thrown him up there with enough force to break his neck. His ribs were sticking out, like something had squeezed him so hard his chest collapsed. We found Blue's collar by the road, covered in blood, but we never found his body. Dad called the tribal police, who called in a ranger from the Forestry Service. The ranger walked around, looked at the tracks, and said it was probably a bear that leaves human-like footprints, a bear that can throw a 70-pound dog onto a roof, a bear that circles a house systematically and makes handprints on the walls. Dad argued with him, but the ranger just wrote something in his notebook about animal disturbance and left. Later, one of the tribal officers pulled Dad aside and told him not to push it, said there had been other reports over the years, and nothing good came from making a big deal about it. Said some of the elders believed certain things should be left alone. We stayed in that house because we had nowhere else to go. Dad installed motion sensor lights all around the property. We got a new dog, but it ran away after a week. For months, I slept with that rifle next to my bed. The screaming in the night continued occasionally, always from the direction of that eastern draw. Sometimes we'd find those tracks in the snow or mud around the house. Once Mom found claw marks on the back door, deep gouges in the wood that Dad sanded down and painted over without saying a word. Over the next few years, more houses were built nearby. Other families reported strange noises, dogs going missing, children having nightmares about the same tall figure. Nobody ever saw it as clearly as I did that night, or maybe they did and wouldn't admit it. People learned to go inside before dark and not to look out their windows at night. I left for college 2 years later and rarely went back to stay overnight. When I did, I'd lie awake listening for those footsteps, that scream. Sometimes I'd hear it, far off in the trees. My parents lived there for 15 years before they were able to move to a different house in town. The elders say we built those houses on land that should have been left alone, that there are things in this world that were here before us and will be here after us, and they don't appreciate being disturbed. I believe them. I've since learned that our reservation isn't the only place with stories like this. There are accounts from tribes all across the country about tall, thin figures that guard certain lands and punish those who trespass. They have different names in different traditions, but the descriptions are always similar. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But I do know that there are some places where humans aren't meant to build homes, some boundaries we aren't meant to cross. And I know that whatever was in those trees is probably still there, watching as more houses go up, more land gets cleared, more ancient paths get paved over. I still can't look out windows after dark, and no matter where I live, I never, ever face my bed toward the east. I still can't explain what happened to us that night in September 2023. It's been eating away at me for months now, and even though we've moved to another state, I can't shake the feeling that something truly fucked up happened to us at Todd Lake. My boyfriend Alex and I had only been living in Virginia for about 3 months when we met John and Mary at a local brewery. They seemed cool, outdoorsy types who knew the area well. We hit it off, exchanged numbers, and started hanging out every couple of weeks. They were the first real friends we'd made since moving, so when they invited us to come hang at their campsite at Todd Lake Recreation Center in George Washington National Forest, we were pretty excited. It was Saturday, September 16th. We hadn't planned to camp overnight, just drive up, hang out, have some drinks and food, then head home. The drive took about 45 minutes from our place, winding through the mountains. It was a beautiful area, all tall pines and winding forest roads. We arrived around 5:30 p.m. with a cooler of beer and some snacks. John and Mary had set up at campsite number 1, close to the entrance of the recreation area. They had a nice spot with a picnic table, fire pit, and their tent already pitched. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. That nice September evening vibe. We got there, cracked open some beers, and started grilling the burgers John had brought. Everything was totally normal for the first few hours. We ate, drank a couple beers each. I had maybe 3 over 3 hours, and sat around the campfire talking. John was telling us about good hiking spots nearby, and Mary was asking about our jobs. Casual stuff. I remember feeling really content, thinking we'd made some good new friends. Around 8:30 p.m., John suggested we all take a walk down to the lake. He said it was beautiful at night and only about half a mile from the campsite. I remember hesitating for a second because it was getting dark, but Mary had one of those headlamp things, and John had a flashlight. Alex was up for it, so I decided to go too. Before we left, I put my phone in the glove compartment of our car. I didn't want to risk dropping it in the dark, and I figured we wouldn't be gone long. Alex kept his phone in his pocket. We each grabbed one more beer for the walk and headed out. The path to the lake was pretty straightforward, just a dirt trail winding through the trees. John led the way with his flashlight, then Mary, then me, with Alex bringing up the rear. I remember getting to the lake and seeing the moonlight reflecting off the water. It was really peaceful. We stood at the edge for a bit, sipping our beers and just looking at the stars. I remember John pointing out some constellation, Cassiopeia, I think. And that's where my memory just stops. The next thing I know, I'm waking up in complete darkness. My first thought was total confusion. Where the fuck was I? I was lying halfway on a trail and halfway on top of Alex. He was on his back with his head turned to the side, and I was partially on top of him with my head also turned to the side. It was like we'd been placed there deliberately, like somebody had arranged our bodies. I felt violently ill, like the worst hangover of my life times 1,000. My head was pounding, my mouth was bone dry, and I felt this weird buzzing sensation all over my skin. When I tried to sit up, the world spun so hard I immediately vomited into the leaves beside the trail. That's when Alex started to stir. He began groaning, and then suddenly bolted upright and threw up too. We were both completely disoriented. I remember him asking, "What the fuck happened? Where are we?" And I had absolutely no answer. We had no idea where we were or how we got there. It wasn't the path to the lake. This was some other trail deeper in the forest. It was pitch black, except for the moonlight filtering through the trees. Neither of us had a phone or flashlight. Alex's phone was gone from his pocket. After we managed to stop vomiting, we tried to figure out what to do. We were both shivering, though it wasn't particularly cold. Something felt deeply wrong. There was this atmosphere of dread all around us that I can't really explain. The forest was too quiet, no insects, no rustling, nothing. Just silence. We decided to follow the trail, hoping it would lead back to the campsite or at least to a road. Walking was difficult. My legs felt weak and shaky, like I'd run a marathon. Alex kept stumbling, and at one point he said his vision was blurry. But we kept going because, well, what else could we do? We walked for what seemed like forever. I kept trying to remember what had happened after we reached the lake, but there was just nothing. A complete blank space where hours should have been. It was like trying to remember a dream that slips away as soon as you wake up. Eventually the trail widened, and we started seeing signs. We realized we were still in the recreation area, but had somehow ended up on one of the longer hiking trails that went deep into the forest. According to a trail marker we passed, we were about an hour's hike from the main recreation center. By the time we stumbled back into the campground, it was 2:30 a.m., according to the clock in our car. 6 hours had passed since we left for the lake. 6 hours that neither of us could account for. The campfire was almost out when we got back, just glowing embers. There was no sign of John or Mary. We called out for them, and after a minute we heard John groan from underneath the picnic table. He crawled out, looking just as disoriented as we felt. "What happened?" he mumbled, rubbing his head. "How did I end up under there?" He claimed the last thing he remembered was being at the lake with all of us. Then nothing until he woke up under the table. We asked about Mary, and John looked around in confusion. We started searching the campsite, calling her name. We found her about 5 minutes later, slumped against a tree in the woods just beyond the campsite perimeter. She was asleep or unconscious, and it took us a while to wake her up. When she finally came to, she had the same story. Remembered the lake, then nothing until we woke her. None of us could explain the missing time. We were all feeling sick and confused. I've never experienced anything like it before. It wasn't like being drunk or high. It was like someone had just erased a chunk of our consciousness. We stayed at the campsite that night because we were all too sick to drive. I barely slept, just lay in the back of our car with Alex, both of us too freaked out to close our eyes. When morning came, John's behavior started to change. He laughed it all off, saying we must have drunk way more than we realized. But that made no sense. I know exactly how much I had, and it wasn't enough to cause blackouts or memory loss. Plus, the sickness didn't feel like a hangover. It felt different, wrong. When we were packing up to leave, Alex realized his phone was still missing. We searched the campsite, our car, the immediate area, nothing. John and Mary helped look for a bit, but they seemed eager to pack up and leave. By Sunday afternoon, Alex was feeling really sick. He had chills, was sweating profusely, and complained that his joints hurt. I wasn't much better. I had developed a pounding headache that wouldn't go away with painkillers and kept feeling waves of nausea. We drove home in silence, both trying to process what had happened. Monday morning, Alex called the ranger station to report his missing phone. The ranger said something that made everything even weirder. They had found a phone in the woods between campsites 5 and 6, way on the other side of the recreation area from where we had been camping. Alex confirmed it was his by describing it. But how the hell did his phone end up there? We were at campsite 1, and we never went anywhere near campsites 5 and 6. The physical symptoms gradually improved over the next week, but the psychological impact has been worse. I started having night terrors, violent dreams where I'm being held down on a cold surface while shadowy figures move around me. I wake up gasping for air, convinced someone is in our bedroom. Alex says I talk in my sleep now, which I never did before. We tried to contact John and Mary a couple times after that weekend, but they always had excuses for why they couldn't meet up. Eventually, they stopped responding altogether. We looked them up on social media recently and found that John has completely deleted his accounts. Mary still has hers, but she's blocked both of us. We moved to Colorado in January 2024, partly because Alex got a job offer, but honestly, partly because we just wanted to get away from Virginia and all the memories of that night. But even with 1,500 miles between us and Todd Lake, I still can't shake what happened. I've researched missing time experiences, looked into whether there could have been something in our drinks, even read about weather phenomena that could cause disorientation. Nothing explains all the elements, the missing time, the physical symptoms, how we ended up so far from the campsite, Alex's phone being found on the opposite side of the recreation area, and why John and Mary cut contact so completely. Sometimes I wonder if they drugged us, but that doesn't explain why they also experienced missing time, unless they were lying. But then, what would be the point? We didn't have anything valuable to steal besides Alex's phone, And if they wanted to hurt us, why arrange our bodies carefully on a trail rather than just leave us by the lake? I still check my body sometimes for marks or scars I can't explain. I take photos of any unusual bruises. I've even considered hypnosis to try to recover the missing memories, but something stops me. Some part of me is afraid of what I might remember. The worst part is not knowing if it was something mundane like contaminated water or bad alcohol, or something more sinister, not knowing if John and Mary were victims like us or somehow involved, not knowing what happened during those 6 hours and why it's still affecting me all these months later. I'm writing this partly to see if anyone else has experienced something similar, especially around that area of Virginia, but also just to get it out of my system. Alex doesn't like talking about it anymore. He says we should just move on, but how do you move on from something you can't explain? How do you forget about 6 hours that were stolen from you? Whatever happened at Todd Lake that night, it changed something in me. I don't feel safe anymore. I don't trust my own memories, and I certainly don't go camping anymore. I still haven't told anyone about what happened last Christmas. My wife says it's safer that way, but I need to get this off my chest, even if I'm writing this anonymously. I've been having nightmares for months now, and maybe writing it down will help me process everything. I'm not Native American, but my wife Sarah is Navajo. We've been married for 3 years, but last Christmas was the first time I went with her to visit her grandmother on the reservation in Arizona. I was excited but nervous too. Sarah had told me a lot about her family and their traditions, but I knew being an outsider meant I had a lot to learn. The drive from Phoenix took about 4 hours. Sarah was quiet for most of the trip, which wasn't like her. When I asked if everything was okay, she just squeezed my hand and said, "Just remember what I told you about respecting the customs, okay? Some things might seem strange to you, but there are reasons for everything." We arrived after dark. The reservation was nothing like I'd imagined. I guess I had some Hollywood version in my head, but her grandmother's house was a modest single-story home with a large yard and mountains looming in the distance. The sky was incredible, though. I'd never seen so many stars in my life. Our dog Baxter came with us. He's a shepherd mix, super friendly and usually pretty chill. Sarah's grandmother, who insisted I call her Grandma May, welcomed us warmly. She was in her 70s but had this incredible energy about her. The house smelled like fry bread and coffee, and despite my nervousness, I felt welcome. We brought in our bags and settled in the guest room. Baxter made himself right at home, sniffing around and eventually curling up at the foot of our bed. Grandma May had prepared dinner, mutton stew, fry bread, and some kind of corn dish that was delicious. We sat around her kitchen table, eating and talking. She asked me about my job, I'm an electrical engineer, and told me stories about Sarah as a kid. After dinner, Sarah's cousin Mike and his wife came over. We played cards and drank coffee until about midnight. It was comfortable and normal, nothing unusual at all. Mike told jokes, everyone laughed, and I started to relax. This wasn't so different from visiting my own family in Ohio. We went to bed around midnight. The guest room had a comfortable queen bed with about 6 blankets piled on it. "It gets cold at night," Grandma May had explained. I fell asleep almost immediately, tired from the drive and all the socializing. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. The house was completely silent except for Sarah's soft breathing beside me. When I sat up, I noticed Baxter was sitting at attention near the bedroom door, his ears perked forward. He wasn't growling or barking, just staring intently at the door like he was listening for something. "Need to go out, boy?" I whispered, trying not to wake Sarah. Baxter didn't respond to my voice at all, which was unusual. I figured he probably needed to go outside too, so I quietly slipped out of bed. The floor was freezing cold, and I wished I'd packed slippers. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and opened the bedroom door slowly, trying not to make it creak. The hallway was pitch black. I turned on my phone's flashlight and headed to the bathroom first. Baxter followed me but stayed right at my heels, which was weird for him. He's normally pretty independent and likes to explore new places. After using the bathroom, I decided to take Baxter outside quickly. I walked through the living room toward the front door, the wooden floor cold beneath my feet. When I opened the front door, a blast of freezing air hit me. It must have been in the 20s, and I shivered in my t-shirt and sweatpants. "Go on, boy," I whispered, holding the door open. Baxter wouldn't go. He took one step toward the door, his nose working overtime, then backed up and sat down firmly behind me. He wasn't whining or growling, just refusing to go outside. I wasn't about to force him out there in the cold if he didn't want to go. "Okay, suit yourself," I told him, closing the door. I was thirsty, so I went to the kitchen to get some water. The kitchen had a window above the sink that looked out onto the driveway where we'd parked our car. As I filled a glass with tap water, I glanced out the window and froze. There was something in the driveway. At first, I thought it was a dog, a really big dog. It was sitting on its haunches near our car, maybe 30 feet from the house. In the moonlight, I could see it was bigger than any dog I'd ever seen, more like the size of a wolf, or even bigger. Its fur looked dark and matted, but what really got me was that it was staring directly at the house, not moving, not sniffing around like a normal animal would, just watching. I'm not easily scared, but something about the way it was so still, so focused, made the hair on my arms stand up. I put down my glass and leaned closer to the window, trying to get a better look. That's when it stood up. The movement was all wrong. I can't explain exactly why, but it didn't move like a dog or wolf should. It was jerky and stiff, almost like a person trying to mimic how a four-legged animal would move. It took a few steps across the driveway, then paused and looked back at the house, directly at the window where I was standing. I swear to God it felt like it was looking right at me, even though there's no way it could have seen me through the darkness. The living room light was off, and the only illumination was from my phone flashlight pointed down at the floor. It moved away after a few seconds, disappearing into the darkness beyond our car. I stood there for at least 5 minutes, waiting to see if it would come back, but there was nothing. Just the empty driveway and the silent desert night beyond. Baxter had stayed right by my side the entire time, pressed against my leg. He wasn't barking or growling, but his body was tense. When I finally decided to go back to bed, he followed right behind me, practically stepping on my heels. I didn't wake Sarah. I figured it was just some stray dog or maybe even a coyote, though it seemed way too big for that. I got back in bed, but it took me a long time to fall asleep. Baxter jumped up on the bed too, which we don't normally allow, but I didn't have the heart to make him get down. He curled up between Sarah and me, still alert and watchful. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon. Sarah was already up and out of the room. Baxter was still on the bed, which was unusual. He's normally the first one up and eager for breakfast. When I got out of bed, he finally followed me, but he seemed reluctant to leave the room. In the kitchen, Grandma May was cooking while Sarah set the table. They were speaking to each other in Navajo, which I'd heard before but couldn't understand. They both smiled when I came in, but something felt off. The conversation had stopped abruptly. "Sleep well?" Grandma May asked, flipping a piece of fry bread in a pan. "Yeah, pretty good," I said, pouring myself some coffee. "Hey, do your neighbors have a big dog? I saw something in the driveway last night when I got up to use the bathroom. Looked like a really large dog or maybe a wolf." The reaction was immediate and alarming. Sarah dropped the fork she was holding, and it clattered loudly on the floor. Grandma May turned from the stove and stared at me, her face suddenly serious. "When?" she asked, her voice sharp. "What time did you see this?" Around 2:30 or 3:00 a.m., I think. I got up to use the bathroom and then came to get some water. It was just sitting in the driveway looking at the house." Sarah and her grandmother exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. Sarah came over to me and put her hand on my arm. "What did it look like exactly?" she asked, her voice tense. I described the animal as best I could, how big it was, how it moved strangely, the way it had stared at the house. Grandma May turned off the stove immediately and went to the phone hanging on the wall. She dialed a number and began speaking rapidly in Navajo. Sarah was still questioning me, asking if I'd felt anything unusual or if the animal had made any sounds. "No, it was completely silent," I told her. "What's going on? Was it something dangerous? A rabid coyote or something?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked genuinely scared, which wasn't like her at all. Sarah's one of the most level-headed people I know. "It wasn't a coyote," she finally said. "And yes, it's dangerous. We need to take care of this." Grandma May finished her phone call and came back to us. "Albert is coming," she said to Sarah, "and he's bringing Thomas." Sarah nodded and squeezed my hand. "Albert is a medicine man," she explained to me, "and Thomas is something like a priest in our tradition." I was confused and starting to get anxious. "For a stray dog? I don't understand." "It's not a dog," Grandma May said firmly. "It's a skinwalker." I'd heard the term before, vaguely, probably from some movie or TV show, but I didn't really know what it meant. Sarah had never talked much about this aspect of her culture with me. "A skinwalker is a witch," Sarah explained, keeping her voice low. "A very dangerous person who has learned dark magic. They can transform themselves to look like animals." I wanted to laugh, to tell them they were overreacting, but the fear in their eyes stopped me. They weren't joking. They genuinely believed what they were saying. "Are you sure? I mean, it looked like an animal to me, just a big dog or something." "Did it move like a normal animal?" Grandma May asked. I remembered the strange, jerky movement. "No," I admitted. "It moved wrong somehow." They both nodded like this confirmed everything. "They're drawn to outsiders," Sarah said softly. "People who don't belong here, who don't know how to protect themselves." I felt a chill run down my spine despite myself. "So what do we do now?" "We wait for Albert and Thomas," Grandma May said, turning back to the stove. "And we eat. We'll need our strength." The breakfast was tense and quiet. Even Baxter wasn't himself. He wouldn't eat his food and stayed glued to my side. About an hour later, Albert and Thomas arrived. Albert was an older man, probably in his 60s, with long gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. Thomas was younger, maybe 40, with a serious expression. They spoke with Grandma May and Sarah in Navajo for a few minutes, occasionally glancing at me. Then Albert approached me. "You saw something last night," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded and described what I'd seen again. Albert listened carefully, nodding occasionally. "It knows you're here now," he said when I finished. "It's curious about you. Outsiders are interesting to them. "What does it want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Albert exchanged a look with Thomas. "Nothing good," he said simply, "but we will protect this house and everyone in it." Thomas had brought a small cloth bag, which he opened on the kitchen table. Inside was what looked like dried sage and some other herbs I didn't recognize. Albert explained they were going to perform a cleansing ritual for the house. Sarah took my hand. "I need to go into town for something," she said. "I'll be back soon. Stay here with Grandma and let them do what they need to do." I wanted to go with her, but something in her expression told me not to argue. After she left, Thomas began burning the sage in a small clay bowl. The smoke was thick and fragrant. He walked through every room of the house, wafting the smoke into corners and around windows and doors. Albert followed behind him, speaking softly in Navajo. When they finished inside, they went outside. I watched through the window as they circled the entire house, Thomas with his smoking bowl and Albert speaking into the wind. They paid special attention to the driveway where I'd seen the creature. Grandma May sat with me at the kitchen table. "You should know some things," she said, her voice gentle but serious. "There are rules here that keep people safe. Rules you didn't know." "What kind of rules?" I asked. "Don't go outside at night if you can help it, especially not alone. If you need to use the bathroom at night, use the one inside. Never the outhouse." She gestured toward a door I hadn't noticed before that apparently led to a small bathroom off the kitchen. "If you see something strange, tell us immediately. Don't wait until morning." I nodded, feeling guilty that I hadn't woken Sarah the night before. And never talk about these things with strangers or people off the reservation. You never know who might be listening. That last part sent another chill through me. The way she said it made it clear she wasn't talking about eavesdropping in the normal sense. Sarah returned about an hour later with a package wrapped in butcher paper. She took it straight to Albert, who was now sitting on the front porch with Thomas. I couldn't see what was in it, but from the way she handled it, it seemed heavy and important. The rest of the day was a blur of activity. Albert and Thomas stayed for hours. There was more burning of sage, more prayers in Navajo. At one point, they went far out into the yard with the package Sarah had brought, which I later learned contained raw meat as some kind of offering. By late afternoon, Albert seemed satisfied that whatever needed to be done had been done. He took me aside before leaving. "You've seen something few outsiders ever see and live to talk about," he said, his voice solemn. "The fact that it didn't try to lure you outside is a good sign. But you must be careful now. You've caught its attention." He gave me a small leather pouch on a cord. "Wear this. Don't take it off while you're here." I put it around my neck, not daring to ask what was inside. It smelled strongly of herbs and something else I couldn't identify. After Albert and Thomas left, there was a palpable sense of relief in the house. Sarah seemed more relaxed, and even Grandma May was smiling again. Baxter finally ate his food and seemed more like his usual self. That night, as Sarah and I got ready for bed, I finally asked her directly about what had happened. "Do you really believe it was a skinwalker?" She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Yes," she said simply. "I do. But how is that possible? People can't just turn into animals." "There are things in this world that science can't explain," she said. "Things that have been part of my people's understanding for centuries. You don't have to believe it, just respect it." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as superstition, but I couldn't shake the memory of that creature's unnatural movement, the way it had seemed to look right at me through the darkness. We slept with the leather pouch Albert had given me on the nightstand between us. Sarah insisted on it. Baxter slept on the bed again, and neither of us objected. I didn't see the creature again during our stay, which lasted 3 more days. We continued to follow the rules Grandma May had laid out. No going outside at night, using only the indoor bathroom after dark, staying alert. The night before we left, Grandma May took me aside. "You're family now," she said, patting my hand. "But there are things about this place, about our ways, that you may never fully understand. That's okay. You don't need to understand everything to respect it." We drove back to Phoenix the next day. As the reservation disappeared in our rearview mirror, I felt a weight lifting that I hadn't even realized was there. Sarah was cheerful again, singing along to the radio and talking about our plans for the new year. I still wear the leather pouch Albert gave me. Sarah says I don't need to anymore, that it was just for while we were on the reservation, but I can't bring myself to take it off. Sometimes at night, I wake up with the memory of that creature's eyes seeming to find me through the darkness, and I reach for the pouch, taking comfort in its presence. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was just a stray dog, and my imagination made it into something more. Maybe the fear I saw in Sarah and her grandmother was about something else entirely. But deep down, I know that's not true. There was something out there that night, something that didn't belong in the natural world as I understand it. I've never told anyone else about this. Sarah says it's safer that way. We're planning to visit her grandmother again next Christmas. Despite everything, I want to go. But this time, I'll know the rules. This time, I'll be prepared. And if I wake up in the night and see something watching the house, I won't wait until morning to tell someone about it. I still can't sleep properly. It's been almost 3 months since it happened, but every time I close my eyes, I see that thing. And Jake's face, the way he just stood there. I keep checking my locks at night, and I've started sleeping with the lights on. I need to get this off my chest, so here goes. My hometown has 2 malls, the new Ridgeview Plaza that opened about 5 years ago, and the old Westfield Mall from the early 90s. Once Ridgeview opened, most stores at Westfield packed up and left. Now it's basically a ghost town with only a few businesses still hanging on. A dingy arcade, a discount shoe store, and this crappy 8-screen movie theater that still shows films a few months after their actual release. Last winter, me and my friends, Jake, Alicia, and Trent, decided to catch this horror movie at Westfield. We were bored out of our minds, and tickets were only $5 because nobody goes there anymore. The movie started at 10 p.m., but we got there around 6:30 because we had nothing better to do in our boring-ass town. The mall was exactly how you'd expect, depressing as hell. Half the lights were burnt out, that generic mall music playing at like 25% volume, and most storefronts were just covered with these temporary drywall barriers with coming soon signs that had been there for years. The whole place smelled like a mix of stale popcorn and cleaning chemicals. We killed time at the arcade, which was weirdly still in business, despite never having more than like 3 customers. The guy running it barely looked up from his phone when we walked in. We played some ancient racing games and this broken air hockey table where the puck kept getting stuck. Around 9:45, we headed to the theater. There were maybe 5 other people in the whole place. The movie was whatever, some generic slasher flick, but it was something to do. When it ended just after midnight, we stepped out into the mall, and that's when it hit me how creepy the place was. All the stores were completely dark. The music had stopped. The only light came from these emergency exit signs and a few dim overhead lights that cast these long shadows everywhere. Our footsteps echoed like crazy. The security guard, who's usually half asleep by the main entrance, was gone. It was just us. "This place is a freaking ghost town," Alicia said, her voice bouncing off the walls. That's when Jake got that look on his face, the one he always got before doing something stupid. "Let's explore the closed-off sections," he said, grinning. I should have said no. We all should have just gone home. But when you're 17 and bored in a small town, bad ideas often sound like good ones. "There's nothing back there," Trent said. "Just empty stores." "Then what's the harm in looking?" Jake shot back. We walked to this one section that was blocked off with a drywall barrier. It wasn't even secured properly, just pushed against the entrance to this wing of the mall. Jake slid it aside, creating this gap we could squeeze through. The barrier made this awful scraping sound against the floor. I remember thinking someone would hear us, but then I realized no one was around to care. The abandoned section was way darker than the main area. We used our phone flashlights, which really only lit up a few feet in front of us. The air felt different here, stagnant and cold, like stepping into a freezer that hadn't been opened in years. It smelled musty, like wet cardboard and mold. This section had been closed for at least 3 years. The stores were completely gutted, no merchandise, just empty shelving units, broken display cases, and debris everywhere. The floor was covered in dust, and our footprints marked the only recent activity. "This is actually pretty cool," Alicia whispered, shining her light at the ceiling where paint was peeling off in these long strips. We wandered deeper, passing what used to be a Bath and Body Works, then a Radio Shack. In what must have been an old clothing store, we found a pile of mannequin parts in the corner. Arms, legs, and these faceless heads all thrown together. It was unsettling, like stumbling across a body dump. Jake, being Jake, picked up one of the mannequin hands. "Check this out," he said, waving it around like an idiot. Then he threw it down the dark corridor ahead of us. We heard it clatter across the floor until it disappeared into the darkness. That's when we heard it. This sound like someone stepping on gravel or broken glass, but slow, deliberate, coming from the direction Jake had thrown the hand. "Very funny, Jake," Alicia said, but Jake was right beside me. "That wasn't me," he whispered. We all froze, listening. The crunching sound stopped. "It's probably just the building settling," Trent said, but he didn't sound convinced. Then something came flying out of the darkness and landed right at our feet. It was the mannequin hand Jake had thrown, except it didn't look right anymore. The plastic was cracked and warped, like something had squeezed it with tremendous force. The fingers were bent backward in impossible angles. "What the fuck?" Alicia whispered, her voice shaking. "Let's get out of here," I said, already backing up. We all turned to leave, but Jake wasn't moving. He was staring down the dark corridor. "Jake, come on," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "I think I saw something move," he said, shaking me off and taking a step forward. "Hello?" he called out. None of us saw him leave. One second he was there, the next he just wasn't. It happened so fast and so quietly. "Jake," Alicia called, her voice rising in panic. "Jake, this isn't funny." We stood there, our flashlights scanning the darkness, but there was no sign of him. The silence was overwhelming, that deep, heavy silence that makes your ears ring. "He's just messing with us," Trent said, but I could hear the fear in his voice. That's when Alicia's phone died, just completely shut off despite having over 50% battery. The sudden loss of light made us huddle closer together. "Jake!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty stores. No response. Trent's phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. When I bent down to pick it up, I pointed the flashlight straight ahead, and that's when I saw Jake. He was standing about 30 feet away, completely rigid, like a statue. His back was to us, and he was looking up at the ceiling. But what made my blood run cold was what I saw standing behind him. It's hard to describe what I saw. My brain didn't want to process it. This thing was towering over Jake. It must have been at least 6 feet tall, maybe more. Its face, if you could call it that, was twisted, with too many teeth crammed into a mouth that took up most of its head. Its eyes were these black, sunken pits. The body was all wrong. It had this short, stunted torso, but its limbs, God, its limbs were like a spider's, too long, too narrow, bending at unnatural angles. Its legs looked like they'd been stretched, and its arms dangled almost to the floor. The skin was this sickly gray color with patches of black all over it, like mold or rot. As I watched, frozen in terror, it placed one of its hands on Jake's shoulder. Its fingers were twice as long as they should be, wrapping all the way around to his collarbone. Jake didn't move, didn't scream, just stood there, rigid, staring upward. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was like my body had shut down completely. Then Alicia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Now!" I flashed the light back to where Jake and the creature had been, but there was nothing there. Both of them had vanished. Just gone. The empty store stretched out before us, with no sign of Jake or whatever that thing was. That broke us out of our paralysis. We ran. We fucking ran like our lives depended on it, because I'm pretty sure they did. We scrambled through the gap in the drywall, knocking it over in our panic. The crash echoed through the mall like a gunshot, but we didn't stop. We sprinted through the main corridor, past the darkened stores, past the silent arcade. I remember the exit doors seemed miles away, like in a nightmare where you're running but never getting closer to your destination. My lungs were burning, but the fear of that thing behind us kept me going. When we finally burst through the exit into the parking lot, the cold air hit me like a slap. We ran all the way to Trent's car, piling in and locking the doors. Trent's hands were shaking so bad he could barely get the key in the ignition. "What about Jake?" Alicia sobbed from the back seat. "We can't just leave him." But we did. God help me, we did, because none of us was willing to go back in there. We drove straight to Jake's house. His mom answered the door in her bathrobe, confused and annoyed at 3 teenagers showing up past 1 a.m. When we asked about Jake, she looked at us like we were crazy. "He's upstairs," she said. "Got home about 20 minutes ago. Said he wasn't feeling well." I felt this wave of relief so intense my knees nearly buckled. Jake was home. He was safe. Whatever I thought I saw in that mall must have been my imagination, right? But when Jake's mom let us come in to check on him, my relief evaporated. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the floor. He didn't look up when we came in, didn't respond when Alicia said his name. "He's been like this since he got home," his mom said, worry creeping into her voice. I was about to call the doctor. I approached him slowly. "Jake, it's me. Are you okay?" He finally looked up, and I had to stop myself from recoiling. His eyes were different, not in a way I could explain, but they weren't Jake's eyes anymore. They were empty, distant, like he was looking through me rather than at me. "I'm fine," he said in this flat, monotone voice I'd never heard from him before. "Just tired. You should go home now." His mom ushered us out, saying he probably just needed rest. As we left, I looked back and saw Jake watching us from the window. He raised his hand to the glass, and for just a second I thought his fingers looked too long, too thin. But when I blinked, his hand looked normal again. Within a week, Jake and his family moved away. No goodbyes, no forwarding address, just a sold sign in their yard that appeared overnight. None of us heard from him again. Alicia, Trent, and I don't talk about what happened. We avoid each other at school now, as if by unspoken agreement. Looking at each other just brings it all back. I've tried researching what we might have seen: urban exploration forums, paranormal websites, local history. Nothing explains what was in that mall. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, waiting in the darkness for someone else to wander in. I drive past Westfield sometimes. It's scheduled for demolition next year. Part of me hopes they tear it down soon, bury whatever's in there under tons of rubble. Another part is terrified about what might escape when they do. I don't go to malls after dark anymore. Any malls. I suggest you don't either. And if you ever hear something, throw back what you've thrown into the darkness. Run. Don't look back. Just run. I've been sitting here for 2 hours trying to figure out how to type this. My hands are still shaking. I'm not sure if writing about it will help or just make everything worse, but I need to tell someone what happened 3 days ago. I can't sleep, I can't eat, and I sure as hell can't close my eyes without seeing that thing. I used to love hiking. God, that sounds so strange to say now. Used to. I've been hiking solo in the mountains near my home in Colorado for almost 15 years. Nothing fancy, just weekend trips to clear my head. It was my escape, you know? The one thing that kept me sane when work got too stressful. Last Saturday was supposed to be just another hike. I packed my usual gear the night before: backpack with water, protein bars, first aid kit, pocket knife, bear spray, flashlight, and an emergency flare kit I've carried for years but never needed to use. Standard stuff. I even checked the weather forecast: clear skies, moderate temperature, perfect hiking conditions. I drove out to my usual trailhead around 7 a.m. The parking lot was empty, which wasn't unusual for that time. I liked the solitude. But when I got to the trail entrance, there was a sign I hadn't seen before: trail closed, rock slide damage, no entry. Crap. I stood there for a minute, not wanting to waste the drive. I remembered another trailhead on the east side of the mountain, about 20 minutes away by car. It wasn't my preferred route, steeper, less maintained, but it would get me up the mountain. The secondary parking area was completely deserted when I arrived. Not even tire tracks in the dirt. I should have seen that as a warning, but instead, I was just happy to have the mountain to myself. I locked my car, double-checked my gear, and set off. This trail was immediately different. Overgrown in places, with branches reaching across the path like they were trying to block the way. The forest was denser here too, less sunlight filtering through. I had to push aside bushes and duck under fallen trees several times in the first mile. My regular trail was nothing like this. It was well maintained, clearly marked. This felt like walking through someone's neglected backyard. About an hour in, I started to wonder if I was still on an actual trail at all. The path would disappear completely in sections, forcing me to navigate by instinct before finding traces of it again. I checked my phone, no service as expected this far up. My GPS app was working though, showing me steadily climbing elevation, so I kept going. 2 hours into the hike, the forest suddenly opened into a small clearing with a stream running through it. The contrast was jarring, almost like stepping from winter into spring. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and the stream water was crystal clear. I stopped to refill my water bottle and rest for a bit. The silence was complete. No birds, no insects, nothing but the soft gurgle of the stream. It should have been peaceful, but something about it felt off, like the quiet was too perfect. I pressed on, following what I thought was the trail back into the forest on the other side of the clearing. The path grew steeper, becoming more of a climb than a hike in some sections. My legs were burning, but I was determined to reach the summit. After another 2 hours of tough hiking, I finally broke through the tree line near the top. The view was incredible. Miles of forest, valleys, and smaller peaks stretching to the horizon. That's when I spotted it. A small cabin, about halfway down the mountain's other side, nestled in a patch of trees. I hadn't seen any structures marked on the trail maps, and curiosity immediately got the better of me. I decided I'd check it out on my descent. I spent about 30 minutes at the summit, eating a protein bar and taking pictures. By then it was around 2 p.m., and I wanted plenty of time to explore the cabin and get back to my car before dark. I started down, taking a different route that I hoped would lead me closer to the structure. Getting to the cabin was way harder than I expected. The forest seemed almost resistant. I know how crazy that sounds. But the trees grew denser as I approached, with no clear path through. Branches scratched at my face and caught on my clothes. Several times I lost sight of the cabin completely, only to spot it again from a different angle, like it had moved. By the time I finally reached it, my arms were covered in scratches, and I was swearing under my breath. The cabin itself was old, really old. The logs were weathered gray with patches of green moss clinging to the north-facing wall. One window was completely broken, while another was just cracked. The roof sagged in the middle like it might collapse under its own weight. A hunter's cabin, I figured, abandoned years ago. It was around 4 p.m. by then. The sun would set in a couple hours, but I still had time to explore before heading back. I approached the front door, suddenly hesitant. The whole place had a heavy feeling about it, like the air was thicker around it. I almost turned back right then. I wished to God I had, but I'd come all this way. I had to at least peek inside. The door creaked open at my touch, swinging inward on rusted hinges. Dust particles danced in the beams of light coming through the windows. The interior was simple. One main room with a stone fireplace, some shelves and racks on the walls, a couple of wooden chairs, and a small table. A layer of dust covered everything, but there were clear spots where items had been moved recently. Someone had been here not too long ago. A doorway to the right led to what looked like a tiny washroom. Just a metal basin and some shelves with rotting towels. To the left was another door, partially open, and straight ahead, at the back of the main room, was a closed door that I assumed led to another room. I moved cautiously to the door on the left, pushing it open slowly. It was a small bedroom with a metal-framed bed, the mattress long rotted away to springs and scraps of fabric. A desk sat against one wall, papers scattered across it. I stepped inside, curiosity overwhelming my growing uneasiness. The papers on the desk were mostly deteriorated, but some had what looked like drawings, crude sketches of the surrounding mountains and something else, figures in the trees that didn't look quite human. I told myself they were just badly drawn deer or bears. When I turned to leave the room, I noticed another door in the corner that I'd missed. It was ajar, showing another bedroom beyond. I pushed it open. The smell hit me first, musty and organic, like old leaves and something else underneath. The room was smaller than the first bedroom, with a desk and chair, but no bed. And behind the desk, Jesus. I still can't believe what I saw. A skeleton. An actual human skeleton slumped against the wall, wearing the tattered remains of what might have been hiking clothes. The fabric was so decayed I couldn't tell the color, but I could make out the shape of a jacket and pants. The skull was tilted back, jaw hanging open like it had died screaming. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the door frame. I needed to get out now, but as I turned to run, I heard it, the front door of the cabin slamming shut. Then footsteps. Something was moving in the main room. Pure instinct took over. I ducked into the room with the skeleton and pulled the door nearly closed, leaving just a crack to see through. My heart was hammering so hard, I was sure whatever was out there would hear it. The footsteps moved across the main room, not the solid steps of boots, but something softer, dragging. Then silence. I held my breath, pressing my eye to the crack in the door. That's when I saw it enter the first bedroom. It didn't walk in, it crawled on all fours, but not like any animal I've ever seen. Its limbs were too long, joints bending at wrong angles. The skin was gray, not pale like a person's, but the actual color of wet cement. Its fingers, Christ, its fingers were twice as long as they should be, ending in black nails that looked sharp as knives. It moved to the center of the room, then raised itself up, sniffing the air. Its feet were all wrong. The toes splayed out like another set of fingers, disjointed and flexible. I could only see its profile, but that was enough to know its face wasn't human. Then it climbed onto the desk in one fluid motion, papers scattering. It looked down at the floor, then toward the door to the room where I was hiding. And it spoke. It fucking spoke. "Who's out there?" A raspy whisper, but perfect English, like sandpaper on glass. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to become part of it. My foot shifted slightly, and the floorboard under me creaked, just the tiniest sound. Its head snapped toward my hiding place with a motion no human neck could make, and I saw its face full on for the first time. The eyes were gray, no pupils that I could see, and sunken deep in the skull. But the mouth, God, the mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth like a fucking shark, disappearing down a throat that looked like a cavern. It let out a shriek that felt like needles in my ears. I slammed the door shut and bolted through the other room, through the main area, and hit the front door with my full weight. It burst open and I was outside, running blindly into the forest, the creature's screams still echoing behind me. I don't remember much of the next part clearly. I was running downhill, crashing through bushes, slipping on rocks. I fell at least twice, gashing my leg on something sharp. My hands were bleeding from grabbing at branches. The light was fading fast, making the forest into a maze of shadows. At some point, I realized I wasn't on any path at all. The mountain slope was getting steeper, and I had no idea if I was even heading in the right direction. All I knew was that I needed to get down, get back to my car. It was almost completely dark when I heard them. More shrieks coming from multiple directions. Not just echoes, there were more of those things out there. I fumbled for my flashlight, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped it, watching helplessly as it bounced away down the slope and disappeared. In desperation, I pulled out one of my emergency flares. I needed light, needed to see what was around me. I struck it, and the harsh red glow illuminated the trees around me. That's when I saw them. Not just one creature, but many, maybe 20 or more, scattered among the trees, some clinging to trunks, some crouched on the ground, all with those same gray bodies and terrible faces, all turned toward me now, their eyes reflecting the flare's light like animals caught in headlights. I ran. I fucking ran like I've never run before. The flare clutched in my hand, casting crazy shadows that made it seem like the creatures were everywhere. Maybe they were. I don't know how I made it down that mountain. I tripped and rolled down a steep section, losing the flare and plunging into darkness again. I crawled, I stumbled, I fell. My clothes were torn, my body bleeding from dozens of cuts. By some miracle, I eventually stumbled onto what felt like a proper trail. I followed it blindly, running when I could, crawling when I couldn't. The shrieks had faded, but I wasn't about to slow down. I don't know how much time passed before I saw the glint of metal through the trees. My car. I've never been so happy to see that beat-up Honda in my life. I practically threw myself inside, fumbling with the keys, certain that at any moment gray hands would smash through the windows. The engine started on the first try, and I floored it out of there, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, and even then I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see those gray shapes following me. I drove straight to the ER, told them I'd fallen while hiking alone. They patched up the worst cuts, asked if I wanted to file a police report. I said no. What would I tell them? That I was attacked by monsters. They'd cart me off to the psych ward. It's been 3 days. I haven't slept more than an hour at a time. Every sound makes me jump. I keep the lights on all night. I've searched online for any mention of strange creatures in those mountains, for missing hikers, for that cabin. Nothing concrete, just a few vague forum posts about weird noises and people feeling watched. I don't know what those things were. I don't want to know. All I know is I'm never going hiking again. Not there, not anywhere. If you're reading this and you like hiking solo in the mountains or woods, stop. Just stop. There are things out there, things that shouldn't exist, things that no one should ever see. And sometimes they can see you first. I'll start by saying I'm breaking a ton of rules by posting this here. Some of my former colleagues might recognize my writing style, but I don't care anymore. People need to know. 20 years in the extermination business specializing in unusual infestations means I've seen pretty much everything, from standard spirit hauntings to less common cryptid colonizations. I've cleared banshees from abandoned hospitals, nixies from suburban swimming pools, and once even a small Wendigo problem in an apartment complex near Duluth. But there's one creature I refuse to take contracts for now. Hide-behinds. I'm writing this as a public service announcement. Hide-behinds are becoming a serious problem, especially in formerly rural areas that have been developed into suburbs in the last decade. They're native to the forests of the northern United States and Canada. But as we keep cutting down their habitats, they're adapting to suburban environments at an alarming rate. Most cryptids or supernatural entities can be captured, banished, or at least contained with the right equipment and knowledge. Hide-behinds are different. Once they've claimed a territory, they're nearly impossible to remove. First documented by Native Americans, particularly Ojibwe and Abenaki tribes, and later by lumberjacks in the Pacific Northwest during the logging boom, hide-behinds earn their name from their most distinctive behavior. They're impossibly quick at ducking behind objects when spotted. In the forest, they'll dart behind trees, rocks, or bushes faster than your eye can track. In homes, they use furniture, doorways, kitchen cabinets, TVs, shower curtains, anything that can momentarily block line of sight. What makes them exponentially more dangerous than other cryptids is their shape-shifting ability. Not true shape-shifting like skinwalkers, but something even more insidious. Hide-behinds appear differently to different witnesses. Some people describe them as emaciated bear-lion hybrids with impossibly long limbs. Others see elderly women with arms that hang to the floor and skin conditions that look like severe rashes or fungal infections. Children often report seeing other children, but wrong somehow, with backward-facing feet or too many fingers. This inconsistency isn't random. Hide-behinds strategically choose appearances that will entice potential victims to investigate further. They're smart, scary smart. My last hide-behind case was about 6 months ago. I'm still having nightmares about it. The client, Tim, contacted me thinking he had a demonic entity in his house. He was a middle-aged guy living alone in a 3-bedroom ranch-style home on the outskirts of a mid-sized Michigan town. The development was only about 7 years old, built on what used to be dense forest. Classic hide-behind territory. I arrived at Tim's place around 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. It was October, already getting dark early, with that damp autumn chill that gets into your bones. Tim had the heat cranked up to 80 degrees and was wearing 3 layers despite it being sweltering inside. First red flag. "Thanks for coming," he said, hand trembling as he handed me a cup of coffee I didn't ask for. "I'm not crazy. I need you to know that before we start." I've heard that line thousands of times, usually from people who are, in fact, experiencing something real, just not what they think it is. "Tell me what you've been seeing," I said, taking out my tablet to make notes. Tim sat on the edge of his sofa, leg bouncing nervously. "It started 3 weeks ago. I was doing dishes, looking out the kitchen window, when I saw something move in the backyard. I thought it was a bear at first. We get them sometimes, digging through trash. But this thing stood up on 2 legs and walked to my screen door. Just stood there, staring in at me." "What did it look like exactly?" I asked, already suspecting. "Huge, brown fur but patchy, like it had mange, long arms. But its face wasn't right. Not quite a bear, more human-like eyes." I nodded. Classic initial hide-behind sighting. They often start with a form that could be mistaken for local wildlife. Then what happened? It disappeared when I blinked. Just gone. I grabbed my shotgun and went outside, but there was nothing there. No tracks, nothing. He took a sip of coffee, spilling some on his shirt from his shaking hands. I figured I was tired, maybe hallucinating. But then 2 days later, I was taking out the trash at dusk. I saw an old woman standing at the corner of my garage, just peeking around, staring at me. Her arms were wrong, too long, hanging almost to the ground. Second stage. I felt my stomach drop. When I called out to her, she ducked behind the garage. I ran over there. Took maybe 3 seconds, but she was gone. Completely vanished. There's nowhere she could have gone that fast. I set down my coffee and pulled up some images on my tablet. "Tim, I need you to look at these and tell me if anything looks familiar." I showed him a series of cryptid sketches, standard procedure to confirm what we're dealing with. When I got to the hide-behind illustrations, his face went white. "That's it. That's what I saw. What the hell is that thing?" I closed my tablet. "It's called a hide-behind. And if what you're telling me is accurate, you need to pack a bag right now and leave this house." Tim laughed nervously. "What, like forever? This is my home. I just paid off the mortgage last year. At minimum, you need to leave for a few weeks while I attempt to clear it. But I have to be honest, hide-behinds are territorial. Once they've selected a hunting ground, they rarely leave, and they're almost impossible to kill." I explained the typical hide-behind behavior pattern. They start by showing themselves briefly from a distance. Then they escalate to closer encounters, always managing to stay just out of reach. The final stage is when they position themselves directly behind their victim, always behind, where you can't see them. By that point, it's too late. Tim scoffed. "So what? I'm supposed to just abandon my house because of some forest boogeyman? I've got a Mossberg 500 and enough ammo to handle any creature. I've met plenty of Tims in my career. Tough guys who think firepower can solve supernatural problems. They're usually the ones I find in pieces. Listen carefully, I said, leaning forward. Hide-behinds don't exist fully in our physical reality. They're partially phased into a different dimensional plane. That's how they move so quickly, and why they can hide behind objects too small to conceal them. Bullets might slow them down, but they won't kill one. The Native Americans figured this out centuries ago. The only defense is to leave the area they've claimed. I showed him photos from previous hide-behind cases. The images weren't pretty. One showed a living room with blood spatter patterns that defied physics, ceiling to floor in perfect vertical lines. Another showed what remained of a family in northern Wisconsin, mainly just scattered teeth and finger bones. That finally seemed to get through to him. Jesus, okay, maybe I'll stay with my brother for a few days. Let you handle this. Good, I said, standing up. Pack now. I'll come back tomorrow to set up some deterrents, but don't get your hopes up. The success rate for hide-behind removal is less than 15%. As Tim went to his bedroom to pack, I walked around the house checking windows and doorways. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were tiny scratch marks on the inside of the door frames. Not on the outside where an intruder would try to get in, but on the inside, as if something was already in the house, trying to get out. I called out to Tim. How long have you lived here alone? About 3 years, he called back from the bedroom. Since the divorce. And when exactly did you first notice strange things happening? I needed to establish a timeline. Like I said, 3 weeks ago with the bear thing. I walked to his bedroom doorway. He was shoving clothes into a duffel bag. Nothing before that? No unusual noises? No feeling of being watched? He paused, thinking. Well, maybe. I don't know. I've had trouble sleeping for a couple months. Keep thinking I hear breathing behind me when I'm in bed. But I figured it was just stress from work. 2 months. This thing had been stalking him for at least 8 weeks. Tim, we need to leave right now. I wasn't being dramatic. Hide-behinds typically only reveal themselves once they're ready to feed. If he'd been seeing it for 3 weeks, we were already in the danger zone. Almost done, he said, zipping up his bag. Just need to grab my meds from the bathroom. As he walked into the ensuite bathroom, I noticed something that made my heart stop. The shower curtain moved slightly, just a tiny flutter like someone had exhaled behind it. Tim, wait. But he was already pulling back the curtain. Nothing was there. He grabbed his prescription bottles from the medicine cabinet and turned back toward me. All set. Let's go. As he walked past me, I caught a glimpse of something tall and spindly, ducking behind him, perfectly matching his movements so it remained directly behind him. I kept my face neutral, not wanting to trigger a reaction from either Tim or the entity. In the living room, I casually positioned myself where I could see Tim's reflection in the TV screen. There was definitely something behind him, something with long, thin limbs and what looked like patchy fur. As I watched, it seemed to flatten itself impossibly thin when Tim turned, always staying in his blind spot. "My car or yours?" I asked, trying to sound normal while reaching slowly for the modified taser in my jacket pocket. Not enough to kill a hide-behind, but it might disorient it long enough for us to escape. "I'll follow you in mine," Tim said, grabbing his keys from the coffee table. "Gives me more flexibility to come back when you've handled this thing." I nodded, moving toward the door while keeping my eyes on Tim's reflection in the windows. The hide-behind was definitely there, hunched over him like a grotesque shadow. "Sounds good. I'm parked just down the driveway." I opened the front door, stepping out first. Tim followed, and as he crossed the threshold, I struck. I whipped around with the taser, aiming just behind his head. There was a shriek, a sound like metal being torn apart, and the air behind Tim seemed to ripple and distort. Tim fell forward onto the porch, yelling in surprise. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and yanking him toward my truck. We made it about halfway down the driveway when Tim suddenly stopped. "My wallet! It's still inside. I can't leave without my ID and cards." "Forget it," I said, still pulling his arm. "I'll help you replace everything." "No, it'll take 2 seconds." He jerked free of my grip and ran back toward the house before I could stop him. I've replayed those moments in my mind thousands of times since then. I should have tackled him, should have knocked him unconscious and dragged him to safety. Instead, I stood there shouting after him as he disappeared back inside. I waited by my truck for 5 minutes, then 10. After 15 minutes of silence, I knew I had to go back in. I loaded my taser, grabbed a specialized UV flashlight from my equipment case, and approached the house cautiously. The front door was still open. "Tim?" I called from the doorway. No response. I stepped inside, sweeping the UV light across the entryway. Hide-behinds leave trace residue that glows under the right frequency of ultraviolet light. Not their physical form, but a kind of dimensional residue where they've phased between planes. The hallway lit up like a Christmas tree. Glowing handprints, if you could call those elongated 6-fingered impressions hands, covered the walls, floor, and ceiling. The density of markings told me this hide-behind had been living here for months, not weeks. "Tim?" I called again, moving deeper into the house. Still nothing. I found the first blood spatter in the kitchen. Not much, just a few drops on the linoleum, then more in the living room, a smear on the wall about shoulder height. The trail led to Tim's bedroom. I won't describe in detail what I found there. Some mental images you don't want in your head. I'll just say that Tim was still technically in the room, but not in any way that could be called living or even whole. The hide-behind had been efficient. I backed out of the room, accidentally knocking a picture frame off the wall. The glass shattered, and in that instant of noise, I caught a glimpse of something ducking behind the bedroom door. Just a flash of movement, too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in impossible directions. That was enough for me. I'm not ashamed to say I ran. 20 years of experience, and I ran like a scared child. Because when a hide-behind has fed, it's at its strongest and most aggressive. And it had clearly marked me as its next meal. I made it back to my truck and drove straight to the nearest hardware store. Bought 5 gallons of gasoline and returned to Tim's house after dark. It's the only way to be sure. Fire doesn't kill hide-behinds. Nothing really does, but it destroys their anchor points, the physical spaces they've claimed as territory. Without those anchors, they're forced to move on. I doused the house thoroughly, focusing on the bedroom and other areas with the heaviest UV residue. Lit a road flare, tossed it through the front door, and watched from a safe distance as the place went up in flames. Called in an anonymous tip to the fire department after it was fully engulfed, enough time for the anchor points to be destroyed, but not so long that the fire would spread to neighboring properties. As I was preparing to leave, I saw something that still haunts me. About 50 yards from the burning house, at the edge of the woods that bordered the development, I caught movement in my headlights. A small boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, peeked out from behind a large oak tree. Our eyes met for a brief second before he ducked back behind the tree. I waited, but he didn't reappear. I knew what I'd seen. The hide-behind had already found a new form, one that would appeal to the neighbors who would inevitably come to gawk at the fire. A lost child, scared and alone in the woods at night. Who wouldn't want to help him? I considered staying, warning people, but what could I say? Don't look for the missing child because he's actually a shape-shifting interdimensional predator? They'd arrest me as the arsonist or the kidnapper, or both. So I drove away, called an anonymous tip about a child spotted near the woods, hoping the increased human activity might discourage the hide-behind from settling there immediately. It was all I could do. Since then, I've retired from the cryptid extermination business. Some risks aren't worth taking, no matter the pay. But I felt obligated to share this warning. Hide-behinds are spreading into suburban areas at an unprecedented rate. They're adapting to human habitations faster than we can track them. If you notice strange movement in your peripheral vision that disappears when you turn to look, if you feel watched in empty rooms, if you glimpse someone or something ducking out of sight repeatedly, don't investigate. Don't try to catch it on camera. Don't call someone like me. Leave immediately. Burn the place down if you can get away with it. Don't return. And if you ever feel that distinctive sensation of being watched, but can't explain why, call your loved ones and say goodbye. Because it's already standing right behind you. It was a Tuesday in late October, cold as hell already, the kind of night where the wind hits the building and makes these low moaning sounds. We're pretty isolated out here. The nearest town is about 30 minutes away, and the facility itself sits back from the main road, surrounded by nothing but open fields and distant hills. At night, it feels like you're at the edge of the world. Around 1 a.m., they brought in this young guy, maybe 23 or 24. Todd was his name. He'd tried to hurt himself after getting into some trouble in town. I remember he looked terrified when they brought him in. Not the usual angry or drugged-out look we often see, but genuinely scared. His eyes were darting around the booking area like he expected something to jump out at him. While the arresting officer was filling out the paperwork, Todd kept mumbling something about an evil little man following him. I figured he was either high or having some kind of episode. We get that a lot, people detoxing or with untreated mental health issues. The protocol is the same either way. Suicide watch, which meant checking on him every 15 minutes throughout my shift. After booking, I escorted him to his cell. The whole time, he kept looking over his shoulder and whispering, "He's here, I can feel him watching." I tried to reassure him, told him he was safe now, but he just shook his head frantically. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "He finds people when they're vulnerable, when they're alone. He likes to hurt people." As I was about to leave his cell, he grabbed my arm, not aggressively, but desperately. "Please," he begged, "leave the lights on. He comes in the dark, please." I'm not usually one to break protocol, but something about his fear seemed so raw and genuine. I left the light on in his cell and told him I'd be checking in regularly. The relief on his face was immediate, like I'd just saved his life or something. For the next couple hours, things were quiet. We only had 7 other inmates that night, unusually empty for us, even though we're a small facility. Every time I did my rounds, Todd would be sitting up on his bunk, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the door. Not sleeping, not even trying to, just watching. Around 3:30 a.m., my supervisor, Kevin, called in sick, which meant I had to cover the entire facility alone until the morning shift arrived at 6. This happens sometimes. We're always understaffed. But that night, it made me uneasy. Something about the emptiness of the place, The way sounds seemed to echo differently. By 4 a.m. I was getting tired, and honestly I was annoyed that Todd was still awake, still staring wide-eyed at nothing. The light in his cell was clearly making it hard for the other inmates nearby to sleep, and one of them started complaining. I decided Todd had calmed down enough that I could turn his light off. When I told him this through the cell door, he went completely pale. "No, please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's waiting for the dark. I can feel him." I tried to be firm but kind. "You need to get some sleep, Todd. I'll still be checking on you every 15 minutes. Nothing bad is going to happen." He started crying then, silent tears streaming down his face, but I had to follow protocol. I turned off his light and continued my rounds. I felt bad, but figured he'd eventually tire himself out and fall asleep. About 20 minutes later, I was at the desk filing some paperwork when I heard it. A scream that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just frightened. It was the sound of someone in pain, in terror. I grabbed my radio and ran toward Todd's cell. What I saw when I got there still haunts me. Todd was pressed against the back wall of his cell, his body contorted in a way that looked physically impossible. His shirt was torn, and there were red marks appearing on his chest and neck, like someone was attacking him. But there was nobody else in the cell, nobody I could see anyway. "Help me," he screamed when he saw me. "He's hurting me. He's here." I fumbled with my keys, shouting for him to hang on. As I opened the cell door, Todd suddenly jerked sideways, like he'd been shoved hard, and fell to the floor. When I reached him, I could see fresh scratches forming on his arms, appearing right before my eyes, as if invisible claws were dragging across his skin. I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone is faking. This wasn't fake. I grabbed Todd and tried to pull him up, but it felt like something was pulling him in the opposite direction. The cell felt ice cold, even though our heating system was working fine everywhere else. "Get me out of here," Todd gasped. "Please." I managed to get him into the hallway where he collapsed, shaking violently. I needed to call for medical assistance, but I couldn't leave him alone. Looking down the corridor, I yelled for any of the other inmates to wake up. Several were already at their cell doors, having heard the commotion. "What's happening?" one of them called out. "I need to call for help," I shouted back. "Can you guys keep an eye on him from your cells?" I spun around, but the hallway was empty. "There's a little man following you," another inmate said, his voice shaking. "He's wearing a uniform like yours, but old-fashioned. He's got a nightstick. He's swinging it at you," a third inmate called out. "Jesus Christ, move." I felt a cold spot pass through me, like walking through a freezer door. Todd suddenly screamed again, clutching at his chest as if something had jumped on him. The ambulance arrived about 15 minutes later, which felt like hours. The EMTs were confused by the situation. Todd had real injuries, scratches and bruises that were still developing, but no clear cause. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, one of the inmates called out to me, "Officer, that thing jumped onto him when they put him on the stretcher. It's riding on his chest right now." The EMTs obviously didn't see anything, but Todd started screaming again as they wheeled him out, fighting against the restraints they'd put on him for his safety. After they left, I went back to the desk, shaking so hard I could barely write up the incident report. The facility was eerily quiet now, like everything was holding its breath. When I looked up from my paperwork, all the inmates were still at their doors, watching me. "You've never seen him before?" one of them asked quietly. I shook my head. "He's been here a long time," the inmate said. "Some of us see him, some don't. He likes the new ones, the vulnerable ones, and he likes people who believe in him. Now you know he's real. He might come for you too." I tried to brush it off as superstition, as the inmates trying to scare me. but I couldn't shake the image of Todd's body being marked by invisible hands, couldn't forget the genuine fear in the inmates' eyes when they shouted at me to move. Around 5:30 a.m. the phone rang. It was the hospital calling to inform us about Todd's condition. The nurse sounded confused. She said Todd was still claiming something was attacking him, even there in the hospital. They'd had to sedate him because he kept screaming about the little man in the uniform, sitting on his chest, squeezing his throat. "Has he got a history of hallucinations?" she asked me. I didn't know what to tell her. I just said we had no prior information about him. When my shift ended at 6, I couldn't bring myself to leave right away. I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost an hour, just staring at the facility. Something about the silhouette of the building against the early morning sky made my skin crawl. Was there a small figure walking along the roofline, or was that just a trick of the light? On my drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror. The empty passenger seat beside me seemed to drop in temperature every few minutes, and twice I had to pull over because I thought I saw something move in my peripheral vision, something small, uniformed, with a nightstick swinging at its side. Todd was transferred to a psychiatric facility the next day. I called to check on him, and the nurse told me he was still sedated. "He gets hysterical every time he wakes up," she explained. "Keeps saying the same thing about a little man who follows him, hurts him." I've been back at work for weeks now, taking my regular shifts, trying to convince myself that what happened that night was just some kind of mass hysteria. Todd having a psychiatric episode that somehow affected all of us. But I notice things now that I never did before. The way the temperature drops suddenly in certain hallways. The strange scratching sounds in the walls during night shifts. The way some inmates refuse to be housed in particular cells, especially the one Todd was in. Last week, I was doing a night check when my flashlight caught something at the end of the corridor. A small shadow that didn't match any object that should have been there. It moved when I moved, but it wasn't my shadow. It was shorter, broader, and seemed to be holding something long and thin. I've requested a transfer to another facility, but until that comes through, I'm stuck here. Now every time I walk those halls alone at night, I feel something following me, something watching, waiting. And sometimes when I'm almost asleep in the break room during my meal break, I swear I can feel a small weight pressed down on the edge of the bed, like someone small just sat down beside me. I don't know what that thing is, or why it's at Chio. I don't know if it's always been there, or if it came with Todd somehow. All I know is that it's real. It can hurt people, and now that I've seen what it can do, I'm afraid it's noticed me too. Last night I found scratches on my forearm after my shift. 3 parallel lines that hadn't been there before. I don't know how much longer I can work here. I don't know if transferring will even help. What if it follows me home? What if it's following me right now? I've never been a superstitious person. Ghosts, monsters, all that paranormal stuff. I'd always laugh it off. That changed after what happened in Sileski last April. I haven't told many people about this. Most wouldn't believe me anyway. But I need to get this off my chest, even if it's just typing it out to strangers. It was supposed to be a fun spring break trip. 8 of us from Ohio State's Outdoor Adventure Club decided to do a 4-day backpacking trek through Sileski State Forest in the Appalachian region. Nothing extreme. We were all experienced enough, having done weekend hikes before, but none of us were hardcore survivalists or anything. Our group was pretty tight. Me, my roommate Jake, his girlfriend Megan, my friend Sarah, and 4 other club members, Chris, Alyssa, Devin, and Taylor. We'd all hung out plenty of times before, gone on day hikes, that kind of thing. This was our first multi-day trip together, though. The first day started normal enough. We parked at the trailhead around noon, checked our gear one last time, and headed out. The weather was perfect for early April, cool but not cold, no rain in the forecast. The trail was moderate difficulty, mostly winding through dense forest with some elevation changes. The plan was to hike about 8 miles to our first campsite. Everything felt fine those first few hours. We talked, joked around, took pictures of the spring wildflowers starting to bloom. But as we got deeper into the forest, something changed. I can't really explain it well, but the woods just started feeling wrong somehow, like when you walk into a room and can tell someone's been arguing, even though everyone's quiet when you enter. By late afternoon, we reached the area where we planned to camp, a small clearing about half a mile off the main trail. It was beautiful, with a little stream nearby for water, but I immediately felt uneasy about it. The spot was nestled in a slight depression, surrounded by thick stands of ancient trees that blocked most of the horizon. It felt too enclosed, too isolated. "Guys, maybe we should find somewhere else," I suggested, trying to sound casual. Everyone looked at me like I was crazy. We'd already hiked 8 miles. It was getting late, and this was the designated camping area according to our trail map. "What's wrong with here?" Chris asked, already shrugging off his pack. "I don't know. Just doesn't feel right," I said, immediately regretting how stupid that sounded. Jake laughed. "Dude, you getting spooked by the woods already? We've got 3 more nights to go." Everyone chuckled, and I forced a smile. "Yeah, whatever. Guess I'm just tired." We set up our tents in a rough circle around what would be our fire pit. Everyone had their own one-person tent except Jake and Megan, who shared a 2-person. I positioned mine facing the small stream, thinking the sound might help me sleep. The evening was normal enough. We got a fire going, cooked our dehydrated meals on portable stoves, passed around a flask of whiskey Chris had brought. People talked about classes, summer plans, told some jokes. But I couldn't shake this weird feeling. The forest around us was unnaturally quiet. No owls, no rustling, hardly even any wind in the trees. Around 10 p.m., we put out the fire and headed to our tents. I was exhausted from the hike, but still felt on edge. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and tried to relax, listening to the soft gurgle of the stream nearby. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke up suddenly at what my watch said was 2:13 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, footsteps, heavy ones, moving slowly around the perimeter of our campsite. My first thought was bear, but these footsteps sounded different, too deliberate, too rhythmic, like a person walking very slowly, heel to toe. They weren't trying to be quiet either, which is what made it even more unsettling. It was almost like whatever it was wanted us to know it was there. I froze in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. The footsteps circled the entire campsite once, then stopped right behind my tent. I could hear breathing, a weird, raspy kind of breathing that sounded almost human, but not quite right. Too labored, too wet-sounding. Then it started moving again, this time stopping at each tent for maybe 30 seconds before moving on to the next. I could tell exactly where it was based on the sound. When it came to my tent again, I nearly stopped breathing altogether. It stood there, so close I could hear what sounded like sniffing, like it was trying to smell who was inside. I wanted to call out to the others to see if anyone else was awake, but I was terrified that making any sound would cause whatever was out there to, I don't know, attack. I just had this overwhelming instinct to stay absolutely silent. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, it moved on again. I slowly, very slowly, shifted in my sleeping bag to look out the small mesh window of my tent. That's when I saw a weird glow about 20 yards away, near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a flashlight or fire, more like a pale, bluish-white orb of light that seemed to hover about 4 feet off the ground. It was faint enough that I thought I might be imagining it at first. As I watched, the footsteps continued circling our camp, but I couldn't see what was making them. The orb just hovered there, unmoving. Then suddenly I heard a snapping noise from the opposite direction, like a large branch breaking underfoot, and the orb vanished. The footsteps quickened, moving toward where the orb had been, then everything went completely silent. Not just the footsteps, everything. The stream I could hear earlier seemed to stop flowing. The normal nighttime forest sounds, what few there had been, disappeared completely. It was like the world had been muted. I lay there, rigid with fear, for what felt like forever. I checked my watch again, 3:47 a.m. Over an hour and a half had passed. I must have eventually fallen asleep from pure exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. When I crawled out of my tent around 7 a.m., everyone else was already up. They were acting normal, making coffee on portable stoves, chatting about the day's hike. I felt disoriented, wondering if I'd dreamed the whole thing. "Sleep okay?" Jake asked, as he handed me a cup of instant coffee. "Did anyone else hear anything last night?" I asked, looking around at the group. Most shook their heads, but Devin paused, looking uncomfortable. "Like what?" he asked. "I don't know. Footsteps? Around the camp?" Devin's face changed. "Holy shit, you heard that too? I thought I was losing my mind." Alyssa, who'd been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Wait, you guys heard it? I did too. I was too scared to say anything." "What about a light?" I asked. "Did either of you see a weird light?" Devin nodded slowly. "Yeah, like a blue-white glow. I saw it through my tent mesh. What the hell was that?" The others were looking at us like we were crazy. Chris suggested it was probably just a hiker passing through with a headlamp, maybe checking out our camp. Taylor thought it might have been local teens messing with us. "At 2 a.m., Devin challenged. "And those weren't human footsteps, man. They were too heavy." "Probably just a deer," Megan suggested. "They can sound really loud at night." But I knew it wasn't a deer. Deer don't walk heel to toe. They don't stand in one spot, breathing heavily. And they definitely don't make strange, glowing orbs appear. We packed up camp and continued our hike. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. 3 of us had experienced the same thing. That wasn't coincidence. As we hiked, I fell in step beside Devin, keeping my voice low. "You really think that was a deer?" I asked. He shook his head. "No way. Whatever was walking around our tents was big, and that breathing sound..." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Like it was almost human, but not quite," I finished. "Exactly," he said, looking relieved that someone understood. "And did you notice how the forest went completely silent after? Like everything was hiding?" I nodded. "Yeah, like whatever it was scared everything else away." That night, we camped at a different site, this one more open, situated on a ridge overlooking a valley. I felt better about this location, less enclosed, more visibility, but I still couldn't shake my unease. We stayed up later, keeping the fire going until almost midnight. No one mentioned the previous night, but I noticed both Devin and Alyssa kept looking into the darkness surrounding our camp. When we finally turned in, I lay awake for a long time, straining to hear any unusual sounds. Nothing came, and I eventually fell asleep. The rest of the trip passed without incident. We completed our loop trail and made it back to our cars on the fourth day. Everyone was in good spirits, talking about doing another trip in the fall. But Devon, Alyssa, and I exchanged glances. None of us brought up what happened that first night again, not even when we were alone. When I got back to my dorm, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started researching online, typing in searches like strange footsteps Appalachian woods and blue orb light forests Ohio. Most results were typical paranormal forums with questionable stories, but a few threads caught my attention. One forum had multiple accounts from hikers in the Appalachian region describing similar experiences. Heavy footsteps circling camps at night, strange lights, and that unnerving silence that fell over the forest. Some people claimed it was Bigfoot, saying the light orbs were often associated with Sasquatch sightings in the Appalachians. But something about that explanation didn't fit what we experienced. The footsteps, the breathing, the deliberate way it had moved from tent to tent. It felt more calculating, more intelligent than what I'd expect from even a hypothetical ape-like creature. Another thread suggested something called the rake, supposedly a pale humanoid creature known to stalk people in forests. That description sent chills down my spine, but most of those accounts seemed like obvious creepypasta fiction. A week after we got back, I reached out to Devon to see if he'd found anything in his own research. He admitted he'd been looking into it too, but hadn't found any satisfying explanations. "I keep thinking about how it stopped at each tent," he said over the phone, like it was checking each one of us, deciding something. "Deciding what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I keep having this feeling like maybe it's not done with us." That conversation happened 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been having trouble sleeping. Sometimes I wake up at exactly 2:13 a.m., the same time I woke up that night in the forest. My dorm room will be completely silent. No roommate breathing, no hum from the mini fridge, nothing, just silence. 2 days ago, Devon texted me at 3 a.m. saying he thought he saw a pale blue light outside his apartment window. Yesterday, Alyssa called saying she keeps hearing footsteps outside her door at night, but when she checks, no one's there. I don't know what was in those woods with us. I don't know if it followed us home, or if we're all just traumatizing ourselves with paranoia. What I do know is that I'm never going back to Selesky State Forest again. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear that same heavy, deliberate footstep pattern coming down my hallway, heel to toe, followed by that wet, raspy breathing right outside my door. I haven't told anyone else from the trip about these ongoing experiences. They'd think we're crazy. Maybe we are. But 3 people don't imagine the exact same thing on the same night. And whatever was stalking our camp that night, I'm convinced it wasn't an animal. Animals don't move with that kind of purpose, that kind of intelligence. I'm writing this all down because I need someone to know what happened. I need to create some record of it in case things get worse. Because that's the feeling I can't shake, that what happened in those woods was just the beginning of something I still don't understand.